The Piney Grove Jacks, J.W. Wallace, The Piney Grove Jacks. Introduction. Let me show you, my people. Pull up a seat. Let me pour you a cup of coffee. Dr. Rob Yarvik, inventor of the mechanical heart. I come with my heart in my hands. Before a young man ever steps through the imposing doors of medical school, he has to reckon with a fundamental truth. There is a vast difference between understanding the mechanics of a pump and understanding the soul of the creature it keeps alive. And a quick nod to the medical journals here. While the history books usually spell the name of that famous artificial heart pioneer, Dr. Robert Jarvik, the poetic weight of your statement is exactly where our story begins. A mechanical heart is a marvel of cold engineering, synthetic valves, and calculated electrical impulses. It can sustain a pulse, but it cannot sustain a community. For that, you need a different kind of architecture altogether. One made of flesh, blood, shared memory, and unvarnished grace. This collection is an offering of that living, breathing heart. It is the raw, unpolished ledger of a place and a people who don't just exist to mark time, but who give a territory its rhythm. From Trustville to Trustville. To understand the fictional red clay roads of Piney Grove, you have to look closely at the soil of the place where we actually plant our boots. We live in Trustville, Alabama, a dot on the map defined by its geographic boundaries, its historic neighborhoods, and its shifting traffic patterns. But a town isn't made of asphalt and property deeds. Over the years, I met a particular cast of characters, ordinary folks carrying extraordinary reservoirs of character, who pulled off a quiet, miraculous piece of spiritual engineering. Through their front porch reliability, their willingness to share a heavy load, and their absolute refusal to let a neighbor stumble alone, they fundamentally transformed our town from Trustville into Trustville. They didn't change the signs on the highway, but they changed the currency of the streets. They made trust the foundational infrastructure of our daily lives. The citizens who gather at the corner booth of Jack's restaurant in Piney Grove are not figments of thin air. They are the concentrated essence of the souls I've encountered right here in our community. They reflect the true landscape of where we live, the wisdom in the scraps. Like Harold processing sausage after a long autumn harvest, our people know that the most valuable things in life are often the fragments others discard. The grace in the stumbles. From Robert's spectacular Friday morning chair collapse to the young preacher's humble descent from the pulpit steps, our community understands that human fragility isn't something to hide. It's the very thing that binds us together. The uncompromised ledger. People like John Springfield remind us that a simple, quiet life anchored by family and faith will always outlast the high-tech, noisy distractions of a rapidly changing world. So like that young scholar standing before the gatekeepers of medicine, I come with my heart in my hands. This book is the pulse of our people. It is an invitation to pull up a mismatched wooden chair, pour a fresh cup of coffee, and step into a territory where the machinery of the modern world fades away, leaving behind nothing but the enduring, satisfying truth of Trustville. The Piney Grove Jacks. Preface. If you have ever spent a crisp, frost-bitten winter morning on a farm in Piney Grove, you know that nothing of value is ever allowed to go to waste. When a hog is processed, the grand cuts, the hams, and the tenderloins get the immediate glory. But the real magic happens later, over by the cast iron grinder, where the scattered scraps and leftover pieces are gathered up. The book you are holding in your hands was crafted in that same tradition. The raw materials. A casual observer looking at the daily goings-on in Piney Grove might see a collection of mismatched fragments. A church secretary pivoting on a dime for a building fund donation, a young preacher losing his vocabulary in front of the deacons, an elderly farmer outsmarts a high-dollar city lawyer in a muddy pasture, a chair leg unexpectedly pierces a grease-softened linoleum floor. Separately, these scraps of small-town life are small, discarded things, oddities and historical footnotes that don't seem to fit into the grand ledgers of the world. But when you gather them up from the counter down at Jack's restaurant, they become the vital ingredients for something substantial, the grinder and the spice. This collection is the ultimate storytelling sausage grinder. The raw, unvarnished truths of human nature are tossed into the hopper together. Then come the spices, a heavy dash of local exaggeration, a generous handful of dry Southern wit, and a healthy sprinkling of Fred Craddock's theology of the incongruent. The fellas at the counter, Jim Henry, Larry, Robert, Jim Robinson, Dan the Man, and Claude Harold, are the ones turning the crank. They grind down the sharp edges of our human pride, the foolishness with the wisdom, and press it all into a narrative that holds together. Others represent all I've met. Billy Ray, Emmett Stevens, Pearl represent a host of angels who impacted my life, unaware. The sizzle and the blessing. When these tales hit the skillet, the effect is immediate. They begin to sizzle over the open flame of a Friday morning breakfast rush, filling the air around the booths with a rich, satisfying aroma of shared laughter and recognition. You can smell the truth of them from clear across the county line. But before a single bite is taken, these stories are treated with the respect they deserve. They are held up to the light, pondered over by the regulars, and, just like a farmhouse breakfast, they are properly prayed over. We offer up our deepest thanksgiving for the sheer joy of being human, for the grace that covers our stumbles, and for the simple privilege of having a community to share the table with. What's left is pure satisfaction, so slide into a booth, treat yourself to a fresh cup of coffee, and partake of the Piney Grove Jacks. It is a meal seasoned by generations, served hot, and guaranteed to stick to your ribs. Chapter 1. Floyd asked, "Have you read this?" In a town where a misprinted church bulletin can cause 3 days of heated theological debate at Jack's drive-thru, you can only imagine what happened when the Piney Grove Funeral Home managed to misplace an entire corpse. It didn't just make the front page of the county weekly, it made the front pages of newspapers as far away as Africa. For a few glorious, terrifying weeks, Piney Grove was the international epicenter of bizarre true crime. The year was 1965, right in the middle of my tenure here. The deceased wasn't one of our regulars. No one at Piney Grove Church had ever seen him before. As it turned out, the man's past was a bit colorful, involving a stint in the state penitentiary. But death is supposed to be the great equalizer, a quiet room where the story ends. Instead, his story got a wild late-night sequel, the midnight break-in. The night before the scheduled visitation, one of the man's former cellmates came by to pay his respects. He was a loyal friend, but unfortunately he chose to process his grief with a bottle of cheap whiskey. By midnight, deeply intoxicated and gripped by a sudden alcohol-induced conviction that his buddy needed one last night out on the town, he returned to the funeral home. He didn't break down the front door. Instead, with the clumsy precision of a drunk convict, he sliced a jagged hole right through the screen of the side porch, slipped inside, quietly flipped open the polished lid of the casket, and hoisted his late friend over his shoulder. Politely shut the casket lid back down, because after all, he wasn't raised in a barn. The morning after. The next morning, the funeral director, adjusting his tie and wearing his finest somber expression, walked into the viewing room to set up the floral arrangements. He stepped up to the casket and lifted the lid to check the lining. He blinked. He closed it. He opened it again. The satin interior was pristine, perfectly pressed and vacant. The man who was supposed to be the guest of honor had vanished into thin air. Panic rippled from the funeral home straight to the pews. We had a church full of bewildered people, an international media circus suddenly brewing, and a distinct lack of a body. Being a church, we did the only logical thing you can do when a crisis hits. We closed the empty casket, rolled it down the aisle, and went ahead and had what we tactfully called a memorial service. We preached him into heaven, even though we weren't entirely sure where he was on earth. The mystery finally unraveled about a week later, halfway between here and Anniston. A pair of local bird hunters were out in the woods with their pointers when they stumbled across a sight that sent them dropping their shotguns. The prevailing theory is that somewhere around the county line, the ex-cellmate finally started to sober up. Imagine the exact terrifying moment the hangover begins to clear, the headlights are cutting through the dark, and you suddenly realize you have a stolen corpse riding shotgun in your Chevy. Panic clearly set in, and he dumped his buddy in the brush and bolted. Once the authorities cleared the scene, Our own Pastor Bledsoe was called out to handle the aftermath. Reverend Bledsoe, a man who had seen just about everything in his years of ministry, kept his composure, marched out into the Alabama pines, and conducted a proper, albeit hasty, graveside service right there on the spot. Reverend Bledsoe said, "I've preached at many funerals, comforted many grieving families, and witnessed the human experience at its most solemn. But to this day, whenever I pass that side porch at the funeral home, I have to chuckle. And then I remember that Piney Grove has always known how to hold two truths at once. Life is fragile enough to make you pray, and strange enough to make you laugh before the amen." The Biscuit Boardroom. Setting: a corner booth at the local Jack's early on a Tuesday morning. The smell of frying bacon and fresh biscuits fills the air. A blueprint for the new church facility is half unrolled on the table, weighed down by a coffee mug and a bottle of hot sauce. Chapter 2. The Drive-In Funeral Home. Debate at Jack's. The grease on the griddle at Jack's Diner had barely begun to pop when the Friday morning summit commenced. A fresh basket of cathead biscuits sat in the center of the table, flanked by a jar of fig preserves and an aluminum carafe of coffee hot enough to strip paint. Normally, the conversation flowed from the Auburn-Alabama game to the absolute state of the county potholes. But today, Billy Ray Huggins slammed a folded copy of the Piney Grove Gazette onto the formica with the force of a gavel. "Y'all look at this," Ray barked, his mustache dipping into his coffee foam. "An outfit from Atlanta is buying up the old tractor dealership on Highway 11. They're building a drive-in funeral home, the Piney Grove Drive-In Funeral Home and Memorial Center." Pastor Cohn paused mid-butter, his knife hovering like a tiny silver broadsword. "A drive-in funeral home? Billy Ray, if you're pulling my leg before my first full cup, I'll have the choir sing the long version of every hymn this Sunday." "It's the gospel truth," Billy Ray insisted. "Says right here you just roll your window down, look through a piece of plexiglass, pay your respects, and keep on idling. Curbside condolences." The family value menu. Retired barber Emmett Stevens took a slow, methodical bite of his sausage biscuit, chewing with the deliberate pace of a man who had heard every lie in the Tri-County area since 1974. "Curbside?" Emmett scoffed. "How are you supposed to have an emotional emergency through a car window? What if you start crying so hard you fog up the glass? Are they going to have extra-large windshield wipers available at the first window?" "Oh, it gets worse," Sister Ruby Adair chimed in, her turquoise jewelry clinking as she shook her head. "A cousin of mine down in Mobile said these corporate types use a family value menu at the intercom box. You pull up, press a button, and choose a number. Give me a number 2 with extra grace, a side of potato wedges, and Rock of Ages on the loudspeaker. Mark my words, next thing you know, they'll give you a punch card. 10 funerals and the 11th one is free." "Now hold on a minute," Earl Possum McClendon muttered, leaning his elbows on the table. Possum was called Possum because he spent half his life under the hood of broken-down trucks, usually looking dead to the world. "I heard from a fella at the co-op that they're putting in a double lane for busy Saturdays. If the line for the deceased is backing up onto the highway, you can use the express lane for quick viewings. They'll have a touchscreen kiosk where you can tap out your favorite gospel track." "It's a sacrilege," Pastor Cohn sighed, rubbing his temples. "A holy transition reduced to a drive-through window. What happened to the dignity of a proper church parlor? The slow walk? The comforting touch of a neighbor's hand?" "Well, now look at the bright side," Billy Ray countered, his eyes lighting up. "My blue heeler Goober hates church clothes, but he loves riding a truck. With this setup, Goober could sit right there in the passenger seat, stick his head out the window, and give a respectful whine to the departed without breaking any sanctuary rules. It's progress." Notes from the back booth. As the debate grew louder, the laughter followed. The table bounced back and forth between outrage and absolute absurdity. "Can you imagine the traffic?" Sister Ruby laughed, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. "You'd have folks trying to bypass the line by cutting through the car wash next door." "And what about the flower arrangements?" Emmett added. "Are they going to strap magnetic wreaths to your hood like a funeral procession that never stops moving?" Unknown to the morning crew, a young man in a sharply tailored navy suit sat quietly in the vinyl booth right behind them. His name was Julian Vance, a junior developer from the Atlanta firm, and he had a legal pad filled with frantic scribbles. Initially, Julian came to Piney Grove to scout local demographics and gauge community resistance. He had expected rigid traditionalism. He hadn't expected a masterclass in Southern satire. As he listened to the group, his pen flew across the paper. Note, no potato wedges. Note, plexiglass window feels cold. Reevaluate. Idea, maybe an outdoor memorial garden where pets are allowed in vehicles? But as the breakfast rush began to wind down, the tone at the corner table shifted. The raucous laughter softened, settling into the familiar, gentle rhythm of old friends who had buried as many people as they had grown up with. A little bit of comfort. Pastor Cohn set his coffee cup down with a soft click. The truth is, he said quietly, it doesn't much matter if it's a double lane on Highway 11 or the front pews of Piney Grove. When Old Man Miller passed last winter, half the town couldn't make it up the church steps because of the ice on the ramp. His widow sat in that foyer nearly by herself until the service started. The table went quiet. Everyone remembered the ice storm. If a window keeps a frail old woman from freezing while she looks at her husband one last time, Pastor Cohn continued, his voice thick with a sudden, unexpected wisdom, then I reckon the Lord can find his way into a drive-through lane just fine. The traditions change, sure. We used to bury folks in the backyard with a mule-drawn wagon. But the love, the remembering, that stays the same, whether you're standing on holy carpet or sitting in a Buick. Sister Ruby reached over and patted the pastor's hand. You're right, Cohn, but if they don't offer complimentary coffee at the intercom, I'm still boycotting. In the booth behind them, Julian Vance smiled. He closed his legal pad, left a $20 bill on his table to cover his untouched cold brew, and slipped out the side door into the bright Alabama sunshine. He had many revisions to make to the blueprint, starting with a very large porch, a slower lane for grief, and a permanent spot for a dog named Goober, because even progress, if it hoped to survive in Piney Grove, had to learn to sit down a while and listen. Chapter 3. The gate was too narrow. The morning sun caught the cherry-red paint of the brand-new John Deere D105, making it gleam like a ruby parked on the gravel lot behind Piney Grove Church. It had a 42-inch cutting deck, headlights, and a cup holder deep enough for a 32-ounce sweet tea. For 3 weeks, the men at Jack's Diner had debated its delivery, each claiming they possessed the precise, professional touch required to manicure the church cemetery without nicking a single headstone. She's a vessel of the Lord's efficiency, Pastor Cohn had declared at the pulpit the previous Sunday. But by Friday morning, the vessel was thoroughly stuck. Billy Ray Huggins had volunteered for the maiden voyage. He had cranked the engine with a roar that scattered every crow within 3 miles, shifted into first, and driven exactly 12 feet before the mower's steel deck slammed into the pressure-treated posts of the cemetery gate with a sickening metallic crunch. "Back it up, Billy Ray," shouted Earl Possum McClendon, squinting through the smoke of his morning cigarette. "I can't back it up, Possum. It's wedged," Billy Ray yelled over the engine's idle. "The gate shrunk." Within 30 minutes, the perimeter looked like a town hall meeting. Sister Ruby Adair stood at the edge of the gravel, her arms crossed tight enough to cut off her circulation. "Shrunk? Billy Ray, wood doesn't shrink 3 inches in a light dew. We didn't measure. I said at 3 consecutive committee meetings, and it is recorded in the minutes by my own hand, that we needed to check the clearance. But y'all were too busy arguing over whether to get the model with the premium seat cushion." "Now, Ruby, let's not cast stones," Pastor Cohn said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. He eyed the gap between the deck and the post. "Though I do wonder, is it possible the humidity caused the earth to shift and bring the posts closer together?" "The earth didn't move, Pastor. Men don't listen," Sister Ruby sighed. The emergency summit at Jack's. By 9 o'clock, the summer heat and collective frustration had driven the entire committee across the highway to the air-conditioned sanctuary of Jack's Diner. Coffee cups rattled against the formica as the debate migrated to the corner booth. "The solution is simple mechanical physics," Emmett Stevens announced, pointing his sausage biscuit at the table. "We take a bottle jack to the left post, pry it 3 inches to the west, and hold it there with a pressure-treated 2x4 until Billy Ray drives through. Once the mower is in the cemetery, it stays there. We built a little lean-to by the tool shed. You can't keep a $2,000 piece of machinery under a tarp by the graves, Emmett, Possum McClendon countered, pouring a generous river of molasses onto his plate. The field mice will chew through the ignition wires by Tuesday. What we need to do is let the air completely out of the tires, grease the sides of the cutting deck with lard from the kitchen, and winch it through with my pickup truck. Lard? Billy Ray looked horrified. You ain't putting pork fat on the church's John Deere, Possum. It's an option. Sitting in the booth behind them, a young state trooper took a slow sip of his black coffee, carefully keeping his eyes on his menu while his shoulders shook with silent laughter. The reality of the tape. Pastor Cohn didn't join in the shouting. He stared down into the dark depths of his third cup of coffee, listening to the familiar chorus of his oldest friends. They had argued over the color of the sanctuary carpet in '92, the youth van in '05, and the exact placement of the fellowship hall water cooler last summer. But looking at Emmett's weathered hands and Billy Ray's slightly stooped shoulders, the pastor realized something else. The old push mowers they had been using for 30 years, the ones they took turns hauling in the beds of their trucks, were getting too heavy for them. The brand new riding mower wasn't just about efficiency. It was a quiet admission that the hands holding the handles were growing tired. Boys, Pastor Cohn said softly. The table quieted down. It was the tone he used right before the benediction. Let me ask you something. Who actually took the tape measure out to the shed gate before we wrote the check to the dealership? Billy Ray blinked. Well, I thought Emmett did. He's the contractor. Emmett shifted in his seat. I asked Possum what the standard clearance was. He said all those gates were 4 feet wide. Possum looked down at his biscuit. They were 4 feet wide, back when we hung them in 1978. But then we replaced the hinges after the big storm in '14, and we used those thicker brackets. Sister Ruby let out a soft, uncharacteristic sigh. The sharpness left her face, replaced by a gentle, knowing smile. Nobody measured, she said quietly. We all just assumed the gate would accommodate whatever we brought to it. Measuring twice. An hour later, the sun was high and hot over Piney Grove. The men walked back across the asphalt, not with jacks or tubs of lard, but with a simple yellow Stanley tape measure. Emmett hooked the metal tab against the inner edge of the left post and pulled the tape across to the right. He stared at the red numbers for a long moment, then looked up at the group. 41.5 inches, Emmett announced. The cutting deck was 42. It wasn't a matter of humidity, shifting earth, or modern engineering. It was just half an inch of stubborn reality. Well, Billy Ray said, patting the hood of the wedge John Deere like an old horse. What do we do now? Unscrew the deck every time we cut it? No. Pastor Cohn smiled, taking a crowbar from the back of Possum's truck. He walked up to the old wooden gate post and tapped the top of it and looked back at his friends. We changed the gate. This old entrance was built for a different time and a smaller set of tools. If we want to keep this place beautiful for the folks who came before us, we've got to build a wider opening for the things coming next. It took the men until late afternoon to unscrew the old latch, pull the post, and reset it 4 inches to the left. Plenty of room for a cherry red John Deere and whatever else the town decided to drive through it. And as Billy Ray finally cleared the threshold, the engine humming a steady, victorious tune, the crowd at Piney Grove realized that the biggest obstacles were never the size of the gates themselves. Still, the assumptions people made before they bothered to look at the numbers. Chapter 4. The Great Backyard. Baptism of Pastor Cohn. Location, Table 4, the corner booth. Jack's Restaurant. Time, 7:45 a.m., immediately following the first biscuit delivery. Overheard by the Piney Grove Senior Adult Day Group. Pass that strawberry jam down here, Gladys, and brace yourself. If you thought the sanctuary clock debate was something, wait until you hear what happened over at the parsonage yesterday afternoon. I promise you on a stack of hymnals, you won't believe it. Well, don't just sit there chewing your bacon, Martha. Out with it. All right, all right. So you know how Pastor Cohn has been complaining about that leak in his above-ground pool? Say the grandbabies can't even splash without the water line dropping 2 inches. Well, yesterday he decided he was going to patch the lining himself instead of paying the pool company. A frugal man, Deacon Ledbetter nodded approvingly. Nothing wrong with that. Oh, there's plenty wrong with how he went about it, Martha wheezed, leaning across the checkered tablecloth. It was 95 degrees out, right? So the pastor decides he doesn't want to get his good clothes wet, but he also doesn't want to get completely soaked because he's got a deacon's meeting later. So he goes into the garage and pulls out his heavy-duty, chest-high church baptismal waders. The ones with the built-in rubber boots? The very ones. Now picture this. It's boiling. He doesn't want to sweat to death inside all that rubber. So for reasons only he and the Lord can understand, he decides to wear nothing underneath but his boxer shorts. Sam nearly choked on his sweet tea. Wait, Pastor Cone was in his boxers and baptismal waders? Exactly, plaid boxers and black rubber up to his armpits, Martha said, slapping the table. He looks over the edge of the pool, spots the tear near the bottom, and climbs up the little plastic ladder. Now, any man who has ever been fishing knows how physics works. But our dear pastor was thinking about theology, not displacement. He steps right into the deep end. The law of gravity and waders. What happened? Gladys gasped, her fork suspended midair. Well, the minute he went under to press the patch onto the vinyl, the water pressure collapsed the top of those waders, and the pool just poured right in. You know what happens to rubber waders when they fill up with 50 gallons of water? They turn into anchor weights. He went straight to the bottom, Ian offered, grinning. Like a stone, Martha laughed, wiping a tear from her eye. He was entirely pinned to the floor of his own pool by his own church equipment. He's thrashing around, bubbles rising, kicking his legs, but those boots weighed about 200 pounds now. He realized pretty quickly he was going to have to abandon ship. So right there under the water, he has to wiggle, squirm, and peel himself entirely out of the waders to break the surface. What the neighbors saw. Now, this is where the story gets truly missionary grade, Martha whispered loudly. Old Mrs. Gable from next door was out on her back porch clipping her prize-winning hydrangeas. She hears a massive splash, looks over the chain-link fence, and watches the pastor of Piney Grove Church explode out of the water like a breaching whale, wearing absolutely nothing but wet, soggy plaid boxers and a look of sheer terror. Oh, mercy, Gladys gasped, covering her mouth. Mrs. Gable told the mailman she thought the rapture had come, but only from the waist down. She said he looked like an oversized river otter trying to scramble over the pool ledge. He didn't even look back for the waiters. He just did a low-profile, commando-style crawl across the lawn and burst through his back door like the law was after him. Deacon Ledbetter shook his head, though his shoulders were shaking with laughter. What did the pastor say at the meeting last night? Not a word about the pool, Martha cackled, but I did notice he was walking a little stiff, and when he sat down he groaned. Ben, if you're heading over to the church office later, you might want to check the baptistry closet. I have a feeling there's a pair of waders currently drying out that smell exactly like chlorine and defeat. Sam raised his coffee mug. To Pastor Cone, a man dedicated to immersion, whether the congregation is ready or not. Piney Grove Casserole Brigade. The grease at Jack's Family Restaurant was a holy substance, capable of sealing in gossip tighter than a mason jar lid. Every Tuesday morning, the back corner booth, the one with the cracked vinyl and the best view of the buffet line, was occupied by the high command of the Piney Grove Casserole Brigade. Miss Ruby presided over the table, her bifocals pushed down her nose as she spread out the fresh print of the Piney Grove Gazette. Beside her sat Miss Pearl, arms crossed over her bosom like a general reviewing troop movements, and Rosemary Jenkins, who was technically a newcomer, but possessed a sharp tactical mind for logistics. All right, girls, look lively, Miss Ruby muttered, her finger tracing down the obituaries. The Gazette just hit the stands. The Casserole Brigade was not an official church committee, but it held more power than the Board of Deacons. Their mission was simple: monitor the passing of the town's matriarchs, identify the newly vulnerable, freshly single widowers, and deploy comfort food with precision timing. There, Pearl said, her sharp fingers slapping the newsprint. Martha Vance passed peaceably in her sleep at 88. Rosemary leaned in. What's the cargo layout on the Vance estate? Two grown daughters out in Birmingham who don't cook anything that didn't come out of a microwave, Ruby analyzed smoothly. And more importantly, her husband, Arthur Vance, 89, owns 40 clean acres of timberland, and hasn't boiled an egg since the Eisenhower administration. A collective hum went up around the table. Arthur Vance was a prime target. He was a retired surveyor, still had most of his own teeth, and drove a spotless Buick LeSabre. The man is going to starve within 48 hours if left to his own devices, Pearl declared. Or worse, he'll start eating those frozen TV dinners and lose his constitution. The line forms to the rear, Ruby said, already pulling a yellow legal pad from her purse. We need a tactical deployment script. Pearl, what's your status? My yellow squash casserole with the crushed Ritz cracker crust is ready for ordnance, Pearl said with a grim nod. It's got enough butter in it to stop a bull elephant's heart, but it'll make a grieving man see angels. Good, you take Wednesday night, Ruby ordered, scribbling it down. Rosemary, what are you bringing to bear? King Ranch chicken, Rosemary said proudly. Heavy on the green chilies. Let him know right out of the gate that life still has some spice left in it. Bold, Ruby approved. Take Thursday. I'll handle Friday with my signature beef and noodle bake. It freezes well, just in case he gets overwhelmed by the Methodist ladies trying to sneak in with potato salad. We all know the Methodists use too much mayonnaise. The strategy was flawless, save for one variable, the human element. On Wednesday afternoon, Arthur Vance was sitting in his quiet living room, staring blankly at a muted television, when the front porch boards creaked. He opened the door to find Miss Pearl holding a Pyrex dish wrapped in a checkered tea towel, radiating the heat of a 350-degree oven. Arthur, Pearl said, her voice dropping into her finest sympathetic register, the Lord put it on my heart to bring you some sustenance in your hour of trial. Well, thank you, Pearl, Arthur said, blinking. That's really nice. Now you eat this while it's hot, she commanded, stepping right past him into the kitchen. And don't you worry about washing the dish. I'll be back on Sunday to retrieve it, and maybe check your pantry. By Thursday, the perimeter had been completely breached. Rosemary arrived with the King Ranch chicken at 4 p.m., only to find Miss Ruby already parked in the driveway, holding a Tupperware container full of triple chocolate fudge cake like a shield. The two generals locked eyes across the hood of Ruby's sedan. Rosemary, Ruby said, narrowing her eyes. I thought you were scheduled for the evening drop. Arthur looks like a man who eats an early supper, Ruby, Rosemary replied smoothly, tightening her grip on her casserole carrier. I didn't want him filling up on sweets before he had his protein. Before a turf war could erupt on the manicured lawn, the front door opened. Arthur Vance stepped out, but he wasn't wearing the black suit of mourning. He was wearing a crisp polo shirt and sharply creased khakis, and he smelled faintly of Old Spice. Behind him stood Billy Ray, the church maintenance man, carrying a toolbox. Oh, afternoon, ladies, Arthur called out, looking surprisingly spry. Just having Billy Ray check the weather stripping on the front door. It's been drafty. Ruby and Rosemary marched up the steps in unison, presenting their culinary offerings. We brought you dinner, Arthur, Ruby said, flashing her most winning smile. Arthur looked at the King Ranch chicken, then at the chocolate cake, and finally gave a sheepish chuckle. Well now, that is incredibly kind of y'all, truly, but I'm afraid you caught me on my way out. Pearl's sedan pulled into the driveway at that exact moment, completing the brigade's encirclement. She rolled down the window. Out? Out where, Arthur? The funeral was only on Tuesday. Arthur cleared his throat, a faint blush creeping up his neck. Well, Pastor Cone stopped by this morning to check on me, and he brought Miss Pearl's squash casserole yesterday. And? Pearl demanded. And it was so good, it got me thinking about how much I missed a home-cooked meal, Arthur said. But Pastor Cone also brought along Miss Pearl's nemesis, Miss Pearl herself, to help him look at my leaky roofline. Only she brought a batch of her own yeast rolls. One thing led to another, and well, Pearl and I are heading down to the diner to get some sweet tea and talk about church committees. The brigade stood frozen on the porch. Miss Pearl, still sitting in her car, gasped so hard she choked on her own peppermint. Miss Ruby slowly lowered her chocolate cake. Rosemary just shook her head with a mixture of defeat and profound respect. Arthur tipped his hat, stepped past the front line defense, and walked down the steps toward Pearl's car, leaving the brigade with 3 heavy dishes and an empty deployment schedule. Back at the corner booth at Jack's the following Tuesday, the Gazette was laid out once more. The air was hot, the music was soft, and the coffee was fresh. Miss Ruby turned the page to the obituaries, her pen hovering over the paper. She looked at Rosemary, then at Pearl, who looked exceptionally smug. "Well," Ruby sighed, crossing out Arthur Vance's name with a heavy black line. "The system works. Sometimes it just works a little too fast." The Piney Grove nursing home food fight. The Tuesday morning after the Senior Olympics, the atmosphere inside Jack's family restaurant was thick with anticipation. The Supreme Court at Table 4 had already heard rumors of a localized atmospheric disturbance over at the Piney Grove nursing home. Still, nobody expected the sheer tactical scale of what went down at the Wednesday lunch shift. Pearl said, "It began, as most great conflicts in Piney Grove do, with a dispute over the seating chart and a complete breakdown of pastoral diplomacy." The nursing facility's ancient central air conditioning unit was once again on the fritz, plunging the dining hall into a swampy 84 degrees. To compensate, Billy Ray Huggins had rigged a massive industrial carpet drying fan in the corner, pointing it directly across the room. Pastor Cohn stood at the head of the buffet line, trying to deliver a pre-meal blessing. Unfortunately, his mind was completely absent, and his metaphors were hopelessly tangled. "Now, Lord, bless this food to our spiritual engines," Pastor Cohn boomed over the roar of the fan. "Let us remember that we are all sheep in the same frying pan, and if we don't keep our biscuits buttered on both sides, the wheel of temptation is going to take a big bite out of our tires." Down in the front row, Miss Pearl sat wrapped in her heavy wool blanket despite the heat, her arms crossed like an iron gate. Right across from her sat her arch nemesis, Possum McClendon. Due to the mystery of the missing hearing aid, Possum had no idea the blessing was even occurring. He was staring intensely at a bowl of mashed potatoes, waiting for the signal to deploy his fork. The catalyst for war was a simple plate of creamed corn. Miss Ruby Adair, acting as the self-appointed auditor of nutrition, noticed that Possum had reached across the table and intercepted the last dish of corn, which had been explicitly designated for the casserole brigade's perimeter. "Possum McClendon," Ruby barked, her voice cutting through the dining hall like a siren. "That dish is the property of the committee. Your behavior is grammatically incorrect and spiritually bankrupt." Possum, only catching the word bankrupt, scoffed. "Ruby, your potato salad protocol was defeated back in 2021. This corn is German style now." With the swiftness of a man 30 years his junior, Possum scooped a massive, dripping tablespoon of the creamed corn onto his crescent wrench and used it as an improvised catapult. Fling. The corn sailed directly over table 4, bypassed Pastor Cohn's shoulder, and caught Sister Ruby dead in the center of her pristine, snow-white halo of hair. The dining room went completely dead silent. Velma, the church hostess, dropped her spoon. Goober the blue heeler, sitting under the table, froze with his tail in midair. Ruby slowly reached up, wiped a yellow kernel from her forehead, looked at her finger, and then capped her ballpoint pen. She looked at Miss Pearl. "Pearl," Ruby said, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register, "authorize the heavy artillery." What followed was 20 minutes of unadulterated, chaotic culinary warfare. Miss Pearl didn't hesitate. She grabbed her signature yellow squash casserole, the one with the crushed Ritz cracker crust, and hurled a massive clump of it across the aisle. It struck Billy Ray Huggins squarely in the chest, leaving a greasy, buttery bullseye right over his denim shirt pocket. "Now I ain't saying I'm right," Billy Ray hollered, wiping squash out of his eyes. "But that casserole has got a trajectory problem. Someone get my cousin on the phone." Instead of retreating, Billy Ray grabbed a bowl of lukewarm brown gravy and began swinging it in a wide, lasso-like circle over his head, spraying a fine mist of sodium over the entire back row before releasing the bowl entirely. It landed upside down on top of Henry Greenwell's head, dripping down his brill-creamed hair like a shiny leather helmet. "Sakes alive!" Henry shouted, completely blinded but thrilled by the commotion. "The Lord has poured out his anointing oil." His sweetheart, Rosemary Jenkins, immediately went on the defensive to protect her man. She grabbed a handful of triple chocolate fudge cake and threw it like a baseball, nailing May Odell's wheelchair right on the armrest. "That's for Henry!" Rosemary yelled. May Odell didn't even flinch. She reached down, scooped up a massive, double-fisted handful of the radical, mustard-based red potato salad from the 2021 archives, which had mysteriously re-emerged for lunch, and hurled it into the path of Billy Ray's industrial fan. The fan caught the heavy, unpeeled red potatoes and atomized them, turning the entire east side of the dining room into a high-velocity shrapnel zone. "Take cover!" Pastor Cohn screamed, diving under the dessert table. "The chariots of fire are returning." The only person who remained entirely unbothered was Emmett Stevens. Emmett was sitting in his faded denim jacket at a small corner table, completely outside the fan's draft. He had strategically pulled a plastic cafeteria tray over his head, like an umbrella, allowing the stray biscuits and flying tapioca to bounce harmlessly off the plastic. He was calmly finishing his fried chicken, watching the senior adults of Piney Grove Church transform the facility into a war zone. Possum McClendon was currently out of ammunition, trying to use a roll of duct tape to seal a bowl of Jell-O to his walker for a mobile mortar strike. Miss Ruby was systematically recording the names of every offender in her ledger, while simultaneously throwing cornbread muffins with pinpoint accuracy. Hubcap, the funeral home grief dog, had abandoned his comforting duties entirely and was running circles around the buffet line, catching flying ham biscuits in midair like a Frisbee champion. Finally, the kitchen doors burst open. "Needle!" Cone marched into the room, holding a giant wooden paddle spoon and wearing an expression that could stop a freight train. "Pastor Cone!" she shrieked. The entire room froze in mid-throw. Possum stopped with a fistful of green beans. Billy Ray lowered a bowl of stewed tomatoes. Pastor Cone slowly peeked his head out from under the tablecloth, a stray piece of macaroni resting on his collar. "Yes, darling?" the shepherd whispered. "Get up off that floor and look at this mess," Needle commanded, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "The bishop is coming to inspect the leaky steeple in 2 hours, and the fellowship hall looks like a blender exploded." The silence stretched, heavy and thick with the scent of apple cider vinegar and defeat. Emmett Stevens slowly lowered his tray umbrella. He took a slow sip of his sweet tea, wiped his mouth with the back of his denim sleeve, and looked out over the battlefield. He looked at Ruby's corn-covered hair, Billy Ray's gravy-stained shirt, and the pure joy on Henry Greenwell's face. Emmett cleared his throat, the sound moving like molasses through the quiet room, and delivered the final truth of the great food fight. "Now you know I'm the town idiot, Needle," Emmett drawled, his voice carrying the final authority of the county. "But you can't blame Cone for this one. The Bible says to feed the hungry, and since the music minister wouldn't let the choir room reverberate like a bathtub, the saints just decided to see how hard a meatloaf bounces off the drywall instead. And if you ask me, Possum's German-style corn has a better range than the preacher's sermons anyway." Piney Grove Community Talent Show and Karaoke Night. The Friday night shift at Jack's Family Restaurant was traditionally reserved for the quiet consumption of hamburger steaks and a mutual agreement to leave the week's grievances out in the parking lot. But on this particular Friday in late June, the vinyl booths had been pushed against the walls, and the air smelled of a volatile mix of pine-scented floor wax, hot fryer grease, and sheer unadulterated stage fright. Pastor Cone had convinced Velma to let the church youth group hook up a rented digital singing machine to the restaurant's loudspeaker system for the first-ever Piney Grove Community Talent Show and Karaoke Night. Pastor Cone stood center stage, which was just the space between the pie display case and the cash register, clutching a microphone with a cord that was already tangled around his ankle. His tie featured a fresh, dark streak of chocolate syrup from an early bird sundae. "Now welcome, saints and neighbors, to the amphitheater of the soul," Pastor Cone boomed, his voice echoing off the formica. "Tonight, we aren't just hiding our talents under a bushel. We are going to let them sing like a runaway freight train on a stormy sea. We've got a full lineup, so let's keep our eyes on the prize and our vocal cords tuned to the frequency of fellowship." Sitting squarely at table 4, the Supreme Court was in executive session to judge the proceedings. Billy Ray Huggins had a clipboard, while Sister Ruby Adair sat with her ledger open, ready to audit the lyrical theology of every performer. Act 1. The Mechanical Melody. The honor of the opening act belonged to Billy Ray Huggins. He marched up to the microphone, hitched up his grease-stained ball cap, and gave the digital karaoke screen a heavy, diagnostic tap with his pocket knife. "Now, I ain't saying I'm right," Billy Ray shouted into the mic, causing a screech of feedback that made Hubcap, the funeral home grief dog, howl from the entryway. "But this computer box has got a serious lag in the digital carburetor. My cousin down in Mobile knows a fellow who sings backing vocals for a traveling bluegrass outfit, and he told me if you don't kick the tempo up 2 notches, the motherboard will overheat." "William Raymond," Sister Ruby barked from table 4, "select your track and cease your unauthorized engineering." Billy Ray cleared his throat and selected an old Johnny Cash standard, "Ring of Fire." It started well enough, but Billy Ray couldn't help tweak the performance. Every time the song mentioned fire, he would pause to explain to the audience the exact structural hazards of an improperly ventilated exhaust manifold. By the third verse, he had abandoned the lyrics entirely to give a spoken word tutorial on how to change the head gasket on a '94 Chevy S10. Sister Ruby scratched a furious line through her ledger. "Performance halted due to mechanical distractions and severe rhythmic heresy," she muttered. Act 2. The Slumbering Solo. Next up was Possum McClendon, who walked to the front carrying his trusty 10-inch crescent wrench in his back pocket and a roll of industrial duct tape slung over his arm. He had been paired with his grandson, Ben, who had selected a classic Hank Williams tune for him. "Hey, good looking." Possum stood before the microphone, adjusted his glasses, and looked at the glowing monitor. The slow, rhythmic blue ball bouncing on the screen, designed to help singers keep time with the lyrics, had an immediate hypnotic effect on him. By the time the steel guitar intro finished, Possum's chin had hit his chest. He didn't sing a single note. Instead, he fell into a deep, upright slumber right on stage, his rhythmic whistling snores bouncing off the ceiling tiles in perfect, stereophonic harmony with the background track. "He's asleep!" Jim Robinson shouted from the counter, his vintage tube socks visible as he leaned forward. "Disqualify him, Ruby. That's outside interference." But before Ruby could bang her pen, Goober the Blue Heeler trot-stepped out from under the counter. Sensing his master was in a tight spot, Goober pointed his nose at the ceiling and began howling the chorus in perfect pitch with the digital track. The entire restaurant erupted into applause, with Velma throwing a piece of bacon to the dog as a tip. Act 3. The High Court of Pop. The definitive climax of the evening occurred when the high command of the Casserole Brigade took the stage. Sister Ruby Adair, Miss Pearl, and Rosemary Jenkins stepped up to the microphone, looking like a 3-woman tribunal of Southern rectitude. Ruby adjusted her gold-rimmed bifocals and selected their track, a classic church hymn, but rearranged for a fast tempo. As the music started, Ruby used her ballpoint pen like a conductor's baton, glaring over the monitor to ensure the audience was paying attention. Her grammar was flawless, her pitch was precise, and she hit the high notes with the force of a small shotgun blast. Miss Pearl added a fierce, rhythmic tambourine rattle, while Rosemary harmonized from the side, keeping her eye on Henry Greenwell, who was loudly cheering from his booth. "They're tearing it up!" Pastor Cone cheered, accidentally knocking over a stack of plastic menus in his excitement. It was an undeniable triumph, right up until the final verse, when May Odell rolled her wheelchair right into the performance perimeter, shaking her lavender curls. "That tempo is entirely too fast for a Baptist hymn, Ruby," May croaked into the shared microphone space. "You're turning the sanctuary into a discotheque." "May Odell, your intervention is unparliamentary," Ruby shouted back mid-lyric. The two matriarchs began a fierce, rhythmic duet of theological corrections, matching each other note for note until the digital karaoke machine let out a loud whistle and shut down completely, its processors overwhelmed by the sheer velocity of Piney Grove's competitive spirit. The final verdict. The dining room fell into a heavy, grease-scented silence as the lights on the karaoke machine went dark. Everyone turned to the end of the counter, where Emmett Stevens sat in his faded denim jacket. Emmett hadn't signed up to sing, maintaining his cherished role as the town idiot to absolute perfection. He slowly lifted his coffee mug, took a slow syrup sip, blew on the steam, and looked at the crowded dining room. He looked at Billy Ray's clipboard, Ruby's corn-covered ledger, and the sleeping possum. Emmett cleared his throat, the sound moving like molasses through the quiet restaurant, and delivered the final judgment of the Piney Grove talent show. Now, Emmett drawled, his voice stretching out the vowels until they filled every corner of Jack's. But y'all are missing the real talent in the room. Billy Ray turned a country song into a tractor manual, Possum managed to use the internet to take a better nap than he does in the committee meetings, and Ruby just managed to outsing a digital computer from Birmingham. If you ask me, the gold medal belongs to Goober, because he's the only one here who actually stuck to the lyrics without trying to fix the plumbing or correct the preacher's grammar. The restaurant erupted into laughter, the tension evaporating into the summer night. Billy Ray clapped Emmett on the back, Sister Ruby closed her ledger with a satisfied click, and out under the hummingbird feeder, the citizens of Piney Grove began helping Velma pull the booths back into place, completely satisfied that while the singing was highly irregular, the fellowship was unassailable. The Friday night karaoke crowd at Jack's Family Restaurant was still buzzing from the high-octane showdown between Sister Ruby Adair's traditional hymnal tempo and May Odell's furious Baptist intervention. The digital karaoke machine sat dark and silent near the pie case, its motherboard temporarily overwhelmed by the sheer volume of Piney Grove's competitive spirit. Pastor Cone was under the dessert table, frantically trying to untangle the microphone cord from his ankle while mixing a metaphor about unplugging the matrix to let the spirit breathe. Billy Ray Huggins had his pocket knife out, ready to perform emergency surgery on the machine's cooling vents, loudly declaring that his cousin in Coleman once bypassed a blown fuse using nothing but a gum wrapper and a prayer. The room was hovering in that tense, mid-performance limbo when Emmett Stevens slowly leaned back against his vinyl stool at the end of the counter. He was wearing his trademark faded denim jacket despite the swampy kitchen heat. He looked over at the stressed-out youth group, then at Sister Ruby, who was already tapping her pen against her ledger, threatening to log the electronic failure as a sign of modern degeneracy. Emmett took a long, syrup-slow sip of his black coffee, set the mug down with a soft clink against the formica, and looked right at the Supreme Court at table 4. A rare, mischievous crinkle appeared at the corner of his eye as he reached up and gave his upper jaw a deliberate, clicking nudge. "Now y'all know I'm the town idiot," Emmett, his voice stretching out the vowels until the whole restaurant went quiet. "But it looks to me like the computer box has given up the ghost, and the pressure's officially off the congregation." He slid off his stool, walked right into the space by the register, and hitched up his denim sleeves. "Since we don't need to worry about hitting the high notes on a television screen anymore," Emmett said, looking directly at a stunned Sister Ruby, "y'all sit tight. Let me play a tune with my false teeth." The dining room dropped into a dead, bewildered silence. Velma froze with a fresh pot of decaf in midair. Even Possum McClendon blinked his eyes open from his booth, sensing a shift in the local atmosphere. Emmett didn't wait for permission. He unhinged his jaw just a fraction, opened his mouth, and began clacking his upper and lower plates together with a rhythmic, percussive speed that defied the laws of dental anatomy. Clack, clack, click, clack, clack, click, clack. It wasn't just random noise. Within 3 seconds, the Supreme Court realized Emmett was playing a perfectly syncopated, high-tempo rendition of Amazing Grace. He was using his hollow cheek cavities as a natural amplifier, shifting the pitch by widening his smile or narrowing his lips, like a seasoned jaw harp player. Billy Ray Huggins dropped his pocket knife onto the table. "Well, burn my clothes," Billy Ray whispered. "He's got a dual overhead camshaft rhythm going in there. That's mechanical genius." By the second verse, the rhythm was so infectious that Miss Pearl started rattling her signature tambourine right in time with Emmett's bicuspids. Henry Greenwell began stomping his boot against the linoleum, shouting, "Play it, Emmett! Play it for the Lord!" Goober the Blue Heeler trot stepped out from under the counter, pointed his nose at the ceiling, and began providing a low, harmonious baritone howl that perfectly tracked the dental percussion. Emmett didn't crack a smile. He kept his face completely deadpan, his eyes locked on the ceiling tiles, his teeth clicking away like a high-speed telegraph machine delivering the gospel. He even threw in a complex triple-click triplet during the chorus that had the church youth group cheering. By the time Emmett brought the final stanza to a resounding, definitive clack, the entire restaurant erupted into a standing ovation. Velma was whistling through her fingers, and Pastor Cone had successfully crawled out from under the tablecloth to clap his hands. Sister Ruby Adair stared at Emmett, her pen suspended in midair above her ledger. For the first time since the Great Potato Salad Schism of 2021, she looked completely at a loss for words. She slowly lowered her glasses, cleared her throat, and looked at her notes. "Well," Ruby murmured, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "The vocabulary was entirely non-existent, so I cannot audit the grammar, but the orthodoxy of the melody was technically unassailable." Emmett slowly slid his plates back into alignment, took a slow bow, and walked back to his stool at the end of the counter like nothing had happened. He picked up his lukewarm coffee and took another slow sip. Pastor Cone shook his head in absolute wonder. "Emmett, I've been preaching the word for 40 years, but I ain't never seen the scriptures delivered via orthodontics. You truly brought the house down." Emmett wiped his mouth with the back of his denim sleeve, looked over at the dark karaoke machine, and delivered the final truth of Friday night. "Preacher," Emmett drawled, his voice flattening the room's lingering tension. "But the modernists think you need a 20-pound digital box from Birmingham and a screen full of moving pictures to make the saints joyful. Turns out, if the pressure's off, the Lord can use whatever's left in an older man's mouth to get table 4 tapping their feet, and it doesn't require a single foot of extension cord to run it." The executive session at Jack's. Pastor Cone was sitting in the corner booth at Jack's restaurant, staring blankly into a bowl of turnip greens. Alton Ray Huggins was sitting across from him, systematically dismantling a chicken fried steak, while Deacon Ledbetter was busy drowning his cornbread in buttermilk. "You look like a low-flying bird has hit you, Pastor," Alton grunted, not looking up from his plate. "Did the finance committee veto the choir robes again?" "Worse," Pastor Cone sighed, rubbing his temples. "Jennifer Herring cornered me. She wants to know the divine purpose behind the creation of the flea." Deacon Ledbetter chuckled, nearly choking on his buttermilk. "That's a trap, Pastor. If you say they don't have a purpose, you're questioning the Creator. If you say they do, you're defending an insect that made my hound dog scratch a hole through the back porch screen last July." The wisdom of Alton Ray. Alton Ray set his fork down with a deliberate, metallic clink. He wiped his greasy knuckles with a paper napkin, shoved his John Deere snapback hat an inch higher on his forehead, and looked at the minister with his characteristic world-weary gravity. "Pastor," Alton said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that could cut through the noise of Jack's lunch rush, "you're looking at the machinery all wrong. A flea ain't a design flaw. It's a calibration tool." Pastor Cone blinked. "A calibration tool, Alton?" "Aye," Alton grunted, leaning forward over the checkered tablecloth. "The Lord knew what he was doing when he put fleas on this earth. He didn't make 'em for the dogs. He made 'em for the deacons and the preachers." "I'm listening," the pastor said, genuinely intrigued. "Think about it," Alton explained, gesturing with a French fry. "If a dog didn't have fleas, he'd just lie out under the shade tree all day long, getting fat, forgetting he's a dog, and thinking he owns the yard. The flea keeps him moving. It keeps him scratching, keeps him alert, and reminds him he ain't the master of his own skin." Alton took a slow sip of his sweet tea and gave Pastor Cone a meaningful look. "It's the same thing in the church, Pastor. If the congregation didn't have a few little things biting at 'em, like a clock debate, a missing box of moon pies, or a 9-year-old asking unanswerable questions, y'all would fall asleep in the pews by 11:30 and never wake up until the potluck. That little girl didn't give you a problem, Pastor. She gave you your sermon for next week. The flea is just the Lord's way of ensuring the flock stays awake during the invitation." Pastor Cone sat back in the booth, a slow, appreciative smile dawning on his face. He looked at Alton, then down at his sermon notebook. Alton Ray, Pastor Cohn said, shaking his head in wonder. I believe that is the finest bit of practical theology I've heard outside of a seminary. Like I told you before, Pastor, Alton grunted, picking his fork back up. You take care of the preaching, and I'll take care of the mechanizing, even when the machinery has 6 legs and lives on a coonhound. Chapter 5. The Bologna Sermon at Jack's Restaurant. If you happen to slide into one of the vinyl booths down at Jack's Restaurant around 10 a.m., you'll catch the second wave of the Piney Grove front porch fleet drifting in for early coffee. It's the perfect theater for storytelling, mostly because the acoustics under Jack's low ceiling are just right for a punchline to carry all the way to the fry station. Just the other morning, Pastor Vance was sitting across from Butch Hampton, leaning over a plate of biscuits, recounting a legendary bit of educational and spiritual warfare that took place back when he was studying with his colleague, Pastor Cohn. The classroom creation. Needle was helping out with the midday supervision at the elementary school annex down the road. It was a chaotic room full of paper bags, thermos lids, and youthful energy. Sitting right at the center table was a pint-sized lad who had unpacked his lunch with a strange, intense focus. Instead of eating, the boy had peeled a slice of processed meat out of his sandwich and was furiously rolling it between his palms, shaping it into a tight, gray-pink cylinder. Needle walked over, hands on her hips, looking down at the construction project. Son, she asked, her voice carrying that distinct teacher cadence, what on earth are you doing with your lunch? The boy didn't even look up. He just kept rolling the meat. I'm making myself a school teacher. Needle's eyes narrowed. Well, I don't care much for your attitude, young man. Pack up your bag. I'm taking you straight to the principal's office. Escalation to the front office. The principal was a man who prided himself on maintaining absolute bureaucratic order, but by October his patience was already wearing thin. He sat the boy down across from his heavy oak desk and listened to Needle's report. The principal leaned forward, resting his elbows on his blotter. Son, he said sternly, your teacher tells me you're playing with your food and making inappropriate comments. Let's hear from you. What are you doing? The boy reached back into his pocket, pulled out a fresh slice of meat he'd salvaged from his bag, and started rolling it between his palms right there in front of the county plaque. I'm making myself a principal, the lad mumbled. The principal's face turned the color of a ripe Georgia tomato. Enraged by the sheer, unadulterated sass sitting in his visitor's chair, he threw his hands up. He decided this particular brand of psychological defiance was more than he was equipped to oversee. The boy didn't need detention. He needed the fear of the Lord. He picked up his desk phone and called Pastor Cohn over at the church house. Preacher, the principal barked into the receiver, you need to get down here. I've got a kid who is completely beyond my authority. He needs some immediate spiritual intervention. Pastor Cohn arrived a few minutes later. The principal quickly explained the bizarre, processed meat standoff in the hallway, warning the minister that the boy was a tough nut to crack. Cohn, a man who prided himself on being creative and innovative, decided that standard fire and brimstone lectures weren't going to work on a 7-year-old artist. He needed a different psychological approach. He told the principal to step out, sat down in the chair across from the boy, and cleared his throat. The lad, completely unfazed by the arrival of the cloth, pulled out his last piece of lunch and began rolling the bologna back and forth in his palm, working it into a smooth, round shape. Pastor Cohn leaned back, put on his warmest, most knowing shepherd's smile, and decided to beat the boy to the punch. Well, son, Cohn said with a gentle, chuckling drawl, seeing as you've already made a teacher and a principal, I guess right now you must be making yourself a preacher. The boy stopped rolling for a split second. He didn't look up. His eyes remained fixed on his palms, but a look of profound, worldly wisdom crossed his young face. No, sir, the boy whispered, giving the meat one final, definitive squeeze. I don't have nearly enough bologna for that. The verdict at the booth. Back at Jack's restaurant, the booth went completely quiet for 3 seconds before Butch Hampton let out a gravelly bark of a laugh that nearly knocked his coffee spoon onto the floor. You know, Butch grunted, wiping his face with a paper napkin, Fred Craddock always said humor is just the things that don't fit together. A little boy, a principal's office, and a theological truth told through a slice of meat. That's about as incongruent as it gets. Pastor Vance chuckled, nodding as he watched the traffic pass on Main Street. It just goes to show you, Butch. You can preach a three-point sermon from the pulpit with all the eloquence in the world. But if you want the absolute unvarnished truth about the ministry, sometimes you have to look into the lunchbox of a third grader. Chapter 6, The Sticky Hazards of Pastoral Preparation. If there is one thing a country preacher learns after a few decades behind the pulpit, it's that the line between a powerful, moving sermon and absolute public humiliation is about the width of a hair. You can spend all week studying the Greek roots, outlining your 3 points, and ironing your best Sunday suit. But the moment you step onto that elevated platform, you are entirely at the mercy of your own human frailties. Pastor Cohn learned this lesson the hard way during a particularly high-stress season of ministry. He quickly discovered that a preacher has to be incredibly careful, not just with the doctrine he preaches, but with the random items he keeps in his trousers pocket. The mid-sermon sealant. It was a crisp autumn Sunday morning at Piney Grove, and the sanctuary air was dry from the old floor furnaces. Right around his second sermon point, Pastor Cohn felt his lips getting painfully parched. Without breaking his preaching cadence, he casually reached into his right coat pocket, retrieved a small plastic cylinder, popped the cap off with his thumb, and liberally applied it to his top and bottom lips. What he didn't realize was that earlier that morning, while frantically using a glue stick to paste a last-minute newspaper clipping into his sermon notes folder, he had absent-mindedly dropped the industrial adhesive into his pocket instead of his tube of chapstick. The application. He rubbed the heavy purple craft glue completely across his mouth. The contact. He closed his mouth to press his lips together and distribute the moisture. The consequences. By the time he opened his mouth to deliver his third point, the modern chemistry of Elmer's adhesive had achieved a perfect, airtight seal. Pastor Cohn stood before the congregation, his eyes wide with sudden terror, trying to speak through a completely immobilized jaw. Every P and B sound required a violent, stretching effort. The deacons in the front row watched in utter fascination as their pastor spent the final 10 minutes of the service sounding like a muffled ventriloquist who was actively being held hostage by his own face. Needless to say, it was a very tough time speaking, and the invitation hymn couldn't come fast enough. The anatomical prayer slip. But as Pastor Cohn later told the folks down at Jack's restaurant, you don't even need industrial adhesive to get your mouth completely stuck. Sometimes the brain takes a wrong turn during a moment of high solemnity and your own tongue betrays you. A few weeks after the glue stick incident, Pastor Cohn was leading the pastoral prayer. The sanctuary was dead quiet, heads were bowed, and he was carrying the congregation into a deep, reverent moment of gratitude. He was trying to convey the supreme importance of the New Testament teachings eloquently. In his mind, the sentence was beautiful. God, we thank you for the divine words that fell from Christ's lips. But the wires in his tired brain crossed mid-sentence, and what actually boomed out over the public address system was, God, we thank you for the lips that fell from his face. The silence that followed was heavy and agonizing. Pastor Cohn kept his eyes tightly shut, his face turning a deep, repentant crimson. He later confessed that right then and there, at the same time the congregation was still supposed to be meditating, he had an overwhelming spiritual urge to slip quietly out the side door of the baptistry and disappear into the woods before anyone could look up and say, Amen. The peroration loop. To top off his season of linguistic misfortune, Pastor Cohn ran into the ultimate phonetic trap during a sermon focused on spiritual readiness. He was trying to preach on the vital importance of biblical preparation. He started the sentence fine, but when he hit the keyword, his tongue stumbled. Church, we must focus on our peroration. He stopped, cleared his throat, and tried to correct it. Excuse me, I mean our peroration. A low giggle rippled through the teenagers sitting in the back pew. Pastor Cohn shook his head, took a deep breath, concentrated with all his might on the syllables, and tried a third time. Peroration. The word had become a psychological wall. No matter how hard he fought to get back to the proper pronunciation, his brain was firmly locked into the rhythm of the mistake. He just kept repeating the nonsense word like a broken country record until he finally had to abandon the point entirely, skip ahead to the closing prayer, and hope the Lord would understand that his heart was ready, even if his mouth was completely out of commission. It just goes to show you that Fred Craddock was right about humor being the things that don't fit. A solemn prayer, an organized sermon, and a mouth that is either literally glued shut or hopelessly tongue-tied do not fit together. But in a place like Piney Grove, it's exactly the kind of unvarnished humanity that keeps everybody coming back next Sunday. The heartbreak. If you sit long enough near the cash register at Jack's, right where the linoleum is worn down to the gray subfloor, you're bound to hear a proper Jack tale. These aren't your standard Sunday morning testimonies. These are the unvarnished back porch chronicles of how folks around here actually operate. The other morning, one of the regulars took a slow sip from a heavy ceramic mug, looked out at the logging trucks passing on the highway, and laid out the gospel truth concerning Cousin John, his wife Mabel, and the delicate nature of a countryman's affections. The pride of the ridge. Now, to understand Cousin John, you have to understand that the man didn't just own a hunting dog, he worshipped the ground that four-legged creature walked on. That hound was a master of the thickets, could strike a trail on a cold rock and tree a coon before the moon cleared the pines. John always swore it was the finest hunting dog a man could ever hope to pass a winter with. Mabel, his wife, was a patient woman, but she knew exactly where she stood on the family totem pole. She was firmly positioned somewhere behind the dog, the tractor, and John's favorite 12-gauge shotgun. She didn't complain about it. She just noted the geography of his heart and went about her business. One Tuesday afternoon, Mabel was out in the side yard, her apron full of wooden pins, snapping heavy denim overalls onto the clothesline. The wind was whipping the sheets, so she didn't hear the hum of the engine until a shiny sedan slammed on its brakes, sending a cloud of red dust rolling over her pristine white linen. The panic on the porch. A stranger piled out of the driver's seat, his face the exact shade of bleached flour. He was clearly from up north, wearing a polo shirt and possessing the frantic, breathless energy of a man who had just disrupted the natural order of the universe. He jogged up to the clothesline, clutching his cap in his hands. "Ma'am! Oh, Lord, ma'am! I am so incredibly sorry," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger back toward the dirt road. "I was coming around that blind curve by the creek, and I didn't see him. A dog ran right out. I ran over him. He didn't suffer, but he's gone." Mabel stopped, a wooden clothespin clamped between her teeth. She took the pin out, dropped it into her apron pocket, and wiped her hands. "Well, mister, that's my husband John's dog," Mabel said, her voice completely flat and calm. "And you need to know, he loved that hound a whole lot. Best hunting dog a man ever had in this county. John doesn't take to losing things well." The stranger swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a fishing cork. "Gosh, I feel terrible. Where is your husband? I need to be a grown-up about this. I should go tell him face to face and offer to pay for the damage." The order of operations. Mabel turned slightly, looking toward the heavy tree line at the back of the property. The steady, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of a double-bit axe echoing through the pines signaled exactly where John was working. "He's right back there behind the smokehouse chopping up some oak logs for the winter," Mabel said. She turned back to the stranger, her eyes dropping into a look of genuine, maternal concern for the man's physical safety. She reached out, patted the stranger's trembling arm, and lowered her voice to a confidential whisper. "Now look here, honey. John's got a terrible weak stomach for bad news, and I don't want you to go back there and shock his system too badly right off the bat. It might break his heart right in two. So do me a favor. Don't tell him it was the dog first. Tell him it was me." Chapter 7. The fluctuating value of a title. If you ever find yourself sitting at the counter down at Jack's when the morning rush lets out, look for Jim Henry. Jim is a man who has spent 40 years observing the fine art of human negotiation from his favorite vinyl stool. He's got a way of leaning back, hooking his thumbs in his suspenders, and delivering a truth so dry it practically rattles. Just the other day, Butch Hampton was complaining about the rising cost of concrete vaults, which naturally led Jim Henry to clear his throat and bring up the delicate relationship between church finances and pastoral vocabulary. The administrative gatekeeper. You can talk all you want about principles, Jim Henry said, stirring a third packet of sugar into his mug. But I've noticed that a person's dignity has a sliding scale, especially when it comes down to the Piney Grove Building Fund. Back when Pastor Cohn was running things, he had himself a fiercely loyal church secretary. Now she was a proper, upright Christian woman who took her job as the gatekeeper of the administrative office very seriously. She kept the calendar straight, kept the deacons in line, and absolutely demanded that the office of the ministry be treated with the utmost reverence. One Tuesday morning, the phone on her desk rang. She picked it up, put on her best professional church voice, and said, "Piney Grove Church, how may we direct your call?" On the other end of the line was a gruff, raspy voice. Didn't give a name, didn't offer a greeting. The man just blurted out, "Yeah, can I speak to the head hog at the trough?" The lecture on etiquette. Well, Jim Henry chuckled, shaking his head. The secretary's jaw dropped so fast it nearly hit the blotter. She blinked, pulled the receiver away to look at it, and then pressed it back to her ear. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice dropping about 3 octaves into a frost. "Who did you say?" The caller didn't miss a beat. "You heard me. Can I speak to the head hog at the trough?" That did it. The secretary bristled like a cornered cat. She sat straight up in her swivel chair, tapped her pen against the desk, and decided it was time to provide some immediate, high-volume correction. "Now you listen to me, mister," she said firmly. "If you are referring to the holy man of God who shepherds this congregation, you may address him as Pastor Cohn, or you may refer to him as Brother Cohn. But I will absolutely not tolerate you calling him the head hog at the trough in this house of worship. It is disrespectful, it is unchristian, and I prefer you change your tone right this instant." The economic pivot. The line went dead quiet for a second, Jim Henry continued, pausing to take a slow sip of his coffee, while the folks at the counter leaned in. Then the fellow on the other end let out a heavy sigh. "Well, that's a real shame," the man said, "because I just had a major stroke of good fortune in the timber business, and I was planning on donating $100,000 straight to your new building fund." Jim Henry grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. I declared the secretary didn't even take time to breathe. The moment that figure, $100,000, hit her eardrums, the holy fire vanished, the etiquette handbook went right out the window, and the mechanics of church administration took over. Without a single second of hesitation, she slammed her hand over the intercom button, looked toward the inner office door, and barked into the receiver. "Hang on right there, mister. I think the big fat pig just walked through the front door." The moral of the counter. The counter at Jack's erupted into a chorus of gravelly chuckles. Butch Hampton nearly choked on his hash browns, wiping. "It just goes to show you," Jim Henry said, setting his mug back down on the saucer with a soft clink. "Fred Craddock always said humor lives in the things that just don't fit. A fiercely righteous defense of the ministry and a sudden desperate scramble for $100,000 do not fit together at all. But when the budget is tight, even the most saintly secretary in the county knows how to herd the livestock." Chapter 8, The Perils of Borrowed Thunder. If you're ever down at Jack's during the mid-afternoon lull, right when the smell of lunch grease is fading and they're brewing the fresh pot for the early dinner crowd, look for Robert. Robert is a retired school bus driver who has spent 30 years listening to kids talk in the back seats, which means he can spot a performance from a mile away. The other day, Jim Henry was talking about how folks try to act like something they aren't, which caused Robert to lay his fork down across his pie plate, lean over the counter, and deliver a classic Jack tale about a young guest preacher who tried to borrow a bit of high-caliber rhetorical thunder. "You see," Robert said, wiping his chin with a paper napkin, "there's a massive difference between a man who knows how to handle a horse and a man who just bought a shiny saddle. A few years back, we had a young, wet-behind-the-ears seminary boy come down to fill the pulpit at Piney Grove while the regular pastor was away. Now, this boy was desperate to make a big impression on the deacons. A couple of weeks before his trip to our neck of the woods, he had attended a big regional camp meeting up in North Georgia, and he'd sat in the back row watching a famous, silver-tongued traveling evangelist work the crowd. Right in the middle of his sermon, that old evangelist leaned way out over the pulpit, looked the congregation dead in the eye, and dropped an absolute bombshell. He shouted, "I have spent some of the happiest moments of my life in the arms of another man's wife. Yes, friends, I have spent some of the happiest moments of my life in the arms of another man's wife." The sanctuary went completely, horrifyingly quiet. People stopped fanning themselves. The deacons stopped breathing. The evangelist let the tension stretch until it was ready to snap. And then he put on a beautiful, saintly smile and added softly, "And that sweet woman was my mother." Well, the crowd just melted. There were audible sighs of relief, a few ladies started weeping, and the young preacher in the back row sat up straight, his eyes wide. He thought to himself, "Lord, have mercy, that is pure gold. I've absolutely got to use that one." The Piney Grove execution. "Fast forward 2 weeks, Robert chuckled, shaking his head. "The young man is standing behind the pulpit right here at Piney Grove Church. It's a sweltering Sunday morning. The air is thick, and the congregation is starting to get that heavy, glazed-over look that usually happens right before the third sermon point. The boy decided it was time to deploy the heavy artillery. He cleared his throat, stepped out from behind the wood, and let the phrase leap out of his mouth with all the theatrical volume he could muster. He pointed a finger at the back wall and bellowed, 'Church, I have spent some of the happiest days of my life in the arms of another man's wife.'" The blank wall of panic. "Now," Robert said, leaning closer to the counter so the fry cook could hear. The setup worked perfectly. The sanctuary went dead silent, except for Evelyn Vance dropping her hymnal into the choir loft. Butch Hampton froze mid-cough. Every eye in the building was glued to that boy, waiting for the safe landing. But right then and there, the high-voltage panic of the Piney Grove pulpit hit him. The wires in his brain didn't just cross, they completely melted down. He let out a long, agonizing pause. He stared at the congregation, and the congregation stared back. The word mother vanished entirely from his vocabulary. The harder he looked for the punchline, the deeper it sank into the fog. The silence stretched for 5 seconds, then 10. His face turned the color of a fresh beet, sweat started pouring down his collar, and he realized he had to say something to close the loop before the deacons marched up the aisle to throw him out. He took a tiny, defeated step back behind the safety of the pulpit, looked meekly down at his notes, and muttered into the microphone, "But for the life of me, I can't remember who she was." The post-sermon verdict. The counter at Jack's went up in a collective roar. Jim Henry slapped his hand against the laminate, and even the cashier let out a loud whistle. "I declare," Robert laughed, picking his fork back up. "The boy didn't even wait for the closing prayer. He closed his Bible, walked straight out the vestibule doors, and I don't think his tires touched the gravel again until he hit the county line. A grand, dramatic confession of love and a total late-stage case of amnesia do not fit together in a house of God. But if you're going to steal another man's thunder, you better make sure you remember where the lightning is supposed to strike." Chapter 9. The Dispatcher's Expedition. If you happen to catch Henry down at Jack's during the rainy season, right when the farmers are stuck inside, and the coffee pot never gets a chance to cool off, you're likely to hear about the time Harold took on the county emergency response system. Henry loves to tell this one while tracing circles in the condensation on his water glass, proving that when it comes to getting things done in Piney Grove, a clever lie will beat an official protocol 7 days a week. The Midnight Marauders. "Now, Harold isn't a man who likes his sleep interrupted," Henry said, leaning back against the vinyl booth. "He works hard all day, and when he hits the mattress, he expects the world to leave him in peace. But a couple of winters back, around 2 in the morning, his wife nudged him hard in the ribs. She pointed out the bedroom window and said, Harold, you left the light burning in the tool shed. It's shining right through the blinds. Harold rubbed his eyes and grunted. I haven't been near that shed since Saturday morning, he said. He slipped on his overalls, walked over to the window, and parted the curtains. Sure enough, the padlocks were busted off, the door was wide open, and he could see two shadows actively loading his vintage John Deere generator and his good steel chainsaw into the back of an old primer gray pickup truck. They were cleaning him out. The dispatcher's delay. Harold walked right over to the kitchen wall phone and dialed the county sheriff's office. Henry continued, chuckling into his mug. The night dispatcher answered with that slow bored drawl they only use after midnight. Harold explained the situation. He said, I've got two fellas in my backyard right now stealing my livelihood. You need to send a deputy down Main Street Extension immediately. The dispatcher let out a heavy bureaucratic sigh. Well, Mr. Harold, I'd love to help you, but we've got a major situation all the way out on the county line. A logging truck flipped over, and every single car we have is out there directing traffic and clearing pine logs. We don't have anybody available in your area right now. Just stay inside, lock your doors, and we'll send someone out first thing in the morning to take a report. Harold stood there in the dark kitchen. He didn't argue. He just said, all right then. He hung up the receiver, pulled his pocket watch out, and slowly counted to 30. The executive adjustment. At 31, Harold picked the phone right back up and dialed the same number. The same dispatcher answered. Harold put on a voice that was as calm and cool as a well-digger's ankle. He said, hello, honey. I just called you a second ago about the boys in my tool shed. Well, I'm just calling back to tell you that you don't have to worry about sending anybody down here anymore. I went ahead and shot them both dead on the spot. They're lying right out by the pump house. And with that, Harold hung up the phone and went to stir the embers in his wood stove. The blue light special. I declare, Henry laughed, slapping his knee. The ink wasn't even dry on Harold's second phone call before the entire county law enforcement apparatus descended on Main Street Extension. Within 4 minutes, you could hear the sirens wailing clearly from the highway. 6 sheriff's cruisers came tearing around the curve, throwing gravel into the ditches. They even had an armed response unit from the next town over, spotlighting the pine trees and jumping over Harold's azalea bushes with their weapons drawn. Needless to say, they caught the 2 burglars red-handed, right as they were trying to hoist Harold's heavy iron anvil over the tailgate. The deputy in charge, a big, sweating fellow, marched right up to Harold's back porch, shining a flashlight in Harold's face. He looked out at the 2 very alive, very handcuffed thieves, then at Harold. Mr. Harold, the deputy barked, completely out of breath. I thought you told the dispatcher that you'd shot 'em both dead. The logic of the front porch? Henry paused, taking a slow sip of his coffee, while the whole counter at Jack's leaned in to hear the finish. Harold just leaned back against his porch railing, took a sip of his hot cider, and looked that deputy dead in the eye. Well, Harold said with a dry shrug, and I thought you told me there wasn't anybody available. The back booth at Jack's erupted. Butch Hampton nearly dropped his fork, and Henry just nodded, satisfied with the delivery. Henry chuckled, wiping the counter with his napkin. An absolute lack of county resources and a sudden 5-car police escort do not fit together in the slightest. But if you want the law to show up in Piney Grove, sometimes you have to give the dispatcher a narrative they can't ignore. Chapter 10. The Ballad of the Blasted Floorboards. I was sitting in the corner at Greasy Cove, staring down at the fresh square of light-colored pine the carpenters had just nailed into the floorboards, and I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. Linda tells me I spend too much time looking at the floor, but when you survive a localized structural collapse in front of a heavily armed teenager, you tend to ponder the geometry of life. It happened just a few days prior, right in the middle of the midday rush. The midday feast. Linda and I had snagged our favorite spot by the window. We decided to skip the low-sodium advice the doctor gave us and went ahead and ordered the works. 2 juicy Angus hamburgers dripping with cheese, a basket of hot salted sweet potato fries, and two of Greasy Cove's legendary fried peach pies waiting on the side. We were sitting there chewing and talking about the nursing home reconstruction, completely content with the world. I was leaning back in my wooden chair, balancing on the back two legs as I've done since the sixth grade, a habit Linda has tried to beat out of me for 40 years. Harold, she said, pointing her fork at me, you're going to wear that wood out. Honey, I replied, these chairs have been here since the Nixon administration. They aren't going anywhere. The entrance of the Ridge Guard. Right then, the bell over the Cove's front door jingled and the whole restaurant went completely quiet. In walked a young lady who looked as if she had just taken a wrong turn from a 19th century frontier. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, wearing a pair of frayed, heavily distressed denim cutoff jeans. But it wasn't the denim that caught everybody's attention. It was the plumbing supplies she was carrying on her hips. On her left hip, a leather sheath housing a stag-handled Bowie knife with a blade long enough to fillet a wild boar. On her right hip, a heavy military-grade .45 automatic pistol strapped into a low-slung gunslinger holster. She walked in with total, unbothered backwoods confidence, looking for the world like a one-woman county militia, just wanting to order a sweet tea to go. The structural relocation. Now, I'm a curious man by nature. Seeing a young lady outfitted for a minor guerrilla war inside a commercial burger joint is what Fred Craddock would call the ultimate incongruent. I shifted my weight, leaning back just a fraction of an inch further on my chair to get a better look at the holster rig. That extra inch was a structural mistake. The ancient grease-softened linoleum in the dry-rotted Alabama pine subfloor beneath my back left chair leg gave an immediate loud shotgun-like crack. Before my brain could even register the failure of the wood, the chair leg completely pierced the floor, sinking 6 inches straight into the foundations of Greasy Cove's restaurant. The sudden loss of altitude sent me into a spectacular, undignified backward tumble. I didn't just fall, I executed a complete aeronautical rotation, hitting the floorboards with the heavy, hollow thud of a sack of seed corn dropped from a height. My sweet potato fries went airborne, landing like a shower of orange confetti right across my chest. The armed response. The entire diner gasped. I lay there on my back, pinned between the table and the overturned chair, looking straight up at the acoustic ceiling tiles. Before Butch Hampton or the Deacons could even slide out of their booths to help, a shadow fell over me. I looked up, and there was the young lady from the Ridge. She was leaning over me, her hand naturally resting right on the grip of that massive .45 pistol, her eyes wide with intense, tactical concern. "Mister!" she boomed, her voice cutting through the smoke of the fry station. "Are you hit? Did somebody take a shot at you?" I looked at the pistol, looked at her Bowie knife, and then looked over at Linda, who hadn't moved an inch. Linda was calmly taking a bite of her peach pie, looking down at me with the cold, unvarnished judgment only a wife of 40 years can muster. "No, ma'am," I mumbled from the floor, brushing a sweet potato fry off my collar. "Nobody shot me. A piece of secular plywood just defeated me." The girl blinked, realized there wasn't a threat, and let out a disappointed sigh, letting her hand drop from her holster. "Well," she grunted, turning back toward the register, "you ought to watch your step, mister. This town's getting dangerous." The view from the floor. The carpenters patched the hole yesterday, but I still like to sit in the same booth and look at the spot. Jim Henry told me later that a man my age shouldn't be falling through the floor in front of armed citizens. But I figure it's just another chapter in the history of Piney Grove. A juicy Angus burger, a beautifully armed mountain girl, and an older man trapped in the subfloor don't fit together in any standard handbook. But as long as the peach pie survives the drop, I reckon we're doing just fine. Chapter 10. The economics of the long game. If you drop into Jack's on a Thursday afternoon right when the heat is bouncing off the asphalt, you'll usually find Larry sitting near the pie carousel. Larry spent 34 years running the rural delivery route for the Postal Service, which means he knows exactly who in this county is actually smart and who is just putting on airs. The other day, the fellas at the counter were arguing about a local political race, complaining that one of the candidates wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. Larry just smiled into his sweet tea, waited for a lull in the noise, and cleared his throat to deliver a classic piece of Piney Grove wisdom. The cruel amusement of the porch fleet. You have to be careful about labeling a man as foolish, Larry said, setting his glass down with a soft thud. A lot of times, a man playing the fool is just running a business model you don't understand yet. It reminds me of a little fellow named Junior who used to hang around Tim Alley's grocery store down by the old crossroads. Now, Junior was a quiet boy, didn't say much, and moved at his own leisurely pace. Because of that, the local boys who sat on the porch benches liked to use him for entertainment. They'd wink at each other and whisper that Junior was 2 bricks shy of a load, or maybe 2 pickles shy of a barrel. To prove their point to any travelers passing through, the boys would call Junior over to the storefront and put on a little show. One of them would hold out his left hand with a shiny, thin dime, and hold out his right hand with a thick, heavy nickel. "Go ahead, Junior," they'd hoot. "Pick whichever one you want. You can keep it." Junior would stand there, look at both coins with an intense, agonizing focus, and then his hand would shoot out and grab the nickel. The porch fleet would absolutely roar with laughter, slapping their knees and saying, "Look at him. He takes the nickel every single time just because it's bigger. He ain't got the sense God gave a turnip." The private intervention. This went on for months, Larry continued, leaning forward against the laminate counter. Every afternoon, Junior would walk away with a fresh nickel, and the boys would get a kick out of their own supposed superiority. Eventually, Tim Alley, the store owner, began to feel a heavy burden of Christian pity for the boy. He couldn't stand to see a local lad get made fun of day after day, right in front of his cash register. One evening, after the porch crowd had cleared out and Junior was left leaning against the ice merchandiser, Tim caught him off to one side. He reached out, patted Junior on the shoulder, and adopted a gentle, instructional tone. "Junior," Tim said softly, "I need to talk to you about those boys outside. They're making fun of you, son. They think you don't know the geometry of a dollar. They think you don't realize that even though a dime is smaller, it's worth twice as much as that nickel. Now tell me the truth. Are you grabbing that nickel just because it's the bigger coin, or what?" The genius of the strategy. Larry paused, letting the rhythmic hum of Jack's ice machine fill the space, while Butch Hampton and Jim Henry leaned in to catch the finish. Junior didn't get upset, Larry smiled. He didn't look embarrassed at all. He just reached into his denim pocket, jingled a massive, heavy collection of coins that sounded like a hardware store cash drawer, and looked Tim dead in the eye. With a completely straight face, Junior whispered, "Well, Mr. Tim, I know a dime's worth 10 and a nickel's worth 5, but if I took the dime, they'd quit doing it." The verdict at the counter. The counter at Jack's erupted. Butch Hampton let out a gravelly bark that caused the waitress to look over, and Jim Henry just shook his head in pure admiration. "I reckon Junior had about $40 in nickels sitting in a coffee can at home by Christmas," Larry laughed, taking another sip of his tea. "A boy who looks completely simple-minded and a steady tax-free daily income stream don't seem to fit the same picture. But if you're willing to let people think you're a nickel short, you can end up with the whole pocket full of change." Chapter 11. The Silver Lining of a Short Memory. If you happen to catch Henry down at Jack's on a Tuesday when the rain is coming down in sheets and the loggers are all parked in the back booths, you'll see him doing his favorite thing, tracing slow, wet circles in the condensation of his sweet tea glass. Henry has a theory about everything, but his absolute finest philosophy concerns the human mind and its spectacular ability to protect itself from reality. Just the other afternoon, after Larry finished his story about Junior and the nickels, Henry leaned his elbows on the counter, waited for the kitchen exhaust fan to die down, and laid out a yarn about Old Man Whipple and the modern medical establishment. The high-tech workover. "Now, Old Man Whipple," Henry began, his voice dropping into that comfortable front porch drawl, "was a man whose body was essentially held together by pure stubbornness and 3 layers of denim. But this past spring, his daughters finally ganged up on him because he was sputtering and backfiring worse than a '53 John Deere tractor. They marched him down to that brand new high-dollar medical clinic over in Springville. This wasn't like seeing old Doc Vance who just patted your stomach and told you to eat less starch. This was a fresh-faced specialist right out of Johns Hopkins, wearing a lab coat so white it'd blind you, and possessing absolutely zero country rapport. They ran that poor older man through the whole gauntlet. They put him in tubes that buzzed like a hornet's nest, drained enough blood to fill a radiator, and tapped on his kneecaps with rubber hammers until his leg nearly kicked a hole in the drywall. By Friday afternoon, Whipple was sitting in a leather chair in the doctor's inner office, looking at a manila file folder that was thicker than the Sunday edition of the Trussville Gazette. The catastrophic diagnosis. The young doctor walked in, Henry continued, shaking his head. He didn't sit down. He just leaned against his mahogany desk, adjusted his gold spectacles, and looked at Whipple with a face as grim as a rainy Monday at the graveyard. "Mr. Whipple," the doctor said, his voice coming out in a cold, sterile clip. "I've reviewed the laboratory analytics and the radiology reports. I am deeply grieved to tell you it is not good. In fact, I have some terrible bad news, and then I have some downright catastrophic news." Older man Whipple didn't flinch. He just leaned his chin on his walking cane and looked the boy dead in the eye. "Look here, son," Whipple said. "I've survived 3 floods, 2 wives, and the Great Depression. Don't go sugarcoating the medicine. Give it to me straight. Let's hear the worst of it." The doctor swallowed hard, cleared his throat, and laid it out. "The bad news, sir, is that you have an aggressive advanced carcinoma. It started in the prostate, it has metastasized into both lungs, and it's currently traveling through your central nervous system. It is completely inoperable. Scientifically speaking, you have 6 months to live, maybe less." The agonizing pause. "Well," Henry said, pausing to take a slow sip of his tea while the whole counter went dead quiet. The room turned to ice. Whipple's head slowly sank into his calloused hands. He sat there perfectly still for a solid 2 minutes, his shoulders hunched over. The doctor stood there holding his breath, waiting for the tears or the praying or the shouting to start. Finally, Whipple let out a long, heavy sigh that sounded like an air brake releasing on a semi-truck. He straightened his back, wiped his face, and looked back at the specialist. "All right, Doc," Whipple said, his voice steady as a rock. "That's a heavy load to carry, but I asked for the truth. Now that we've got that out of the way, go ahead and let me have it. What's the really bad news?" The ultimate diagnosis. The doctor stared at him. Henry laughed, his eyes crinkling. He completely blinked in utter confusion. He looked at his charts, looked back at Whipple, and wondered if the older man's ears were full of wax. "Mr. Whipple," the doctor stammered, pointing at a secondary brain scan, "perhaps you didn't comprehend the geometry of what I just said. But regardless, the catastrophic news is that according to your neurological mapping, you are suffering from a lightning-fast, aggressively advancing case of absolute Alzheimer's disease. Your cognitive memory is slipping like a wet clutch on a steep hill." Henry grinned, slapping his hand flat against the laminate counter. "I declare, the second the word Alzheimer's hit the air, old man Whipple's face completely transformed. The dark clouds vanished. A brilliant, high-wattage smile cut right through his wrinkles, and he slapped his knee so hard it echoed down the hallway. He looked up at the ceiling, let out a joyous hoot, and shouted, "Well, thank the good Lord above. I am absolutely elated. For a split second there, Doc, I was terrified you were about to tell me I had cancer." The verdict of the regulars. The counter at Jack's exploded into a chorus of gravelly barks and clinking coffee spoons. Butch Hampton nearly choked on his peach pie, wiping his mustache with a paper napkin, while Robert just shook his head in pure admiration. A terminal medical sentence and a spirit of absolute hallelujah thanksgiving do not fit into the same doctor's office. But in this life, if your mind is going to betray you anyway, you might as well let it forget the trouble before the trouble even has a chance to start. Chapter 12. The Sanitary Standards of the Ridge. If you ever happen to be down at Jack's when Dan the man is in the building, You'd better clear a little extra space at the counter. Dan doesn't just tell a story. He uses his whole upper torso, waving his fork like a symphony conductor to make sure the punchline lands with maximum velocity. Just yesterday afternoon, the waitress set down a platter of chicken fried steak, and Dan spent a good 30 seconds examining the rim of his plate with an amateur detective's intensity. That naturally reminded him of a legendary summer a city slicker grandson spent up on his old grandfather's ridge farm. This tale lays out the absolute gospel truth about rural domestic engineering. The glaze of the first breakfast. Now this boy was from Atlanta, Dan the man began, throwing his thumbs into his pockets and leaning back. He was used to automatic dishwashers, sterile silverware, and parents who worried about bacteria. So when he got dropped off at his granddaddy's cabin for July, his system wasn't quite calibrated for the wilderness. The very first morning, the old man whipped up a heavy farmhouse breakfast, fried eggs, crisp fatback bacon, and buttermilk biscuits. He slid a plate across the oilcloth table to the boy. The lad picked up his fork but stopped dead in his tracks. He noticed a strange, dull, film-like substance coating the entire surface of the stoneware. It had an opaque sheen, almost like an unlisted ingredient from last Tuesday's supper. The boy blinked, tilted the plate in the morning light, and asked, "Grandfather, are you completely sure these plates are sanitary?" The old gentleman didn't even look up from his coffee. He just gave a slow, definitive nod of his head. "Son," he said in a low, gravelly drawl, "I'm going to tell you right now, those plates are just as clean as cold water can get them. Now go on and eat before the grease hardens." The gravy rim of the midday feast. "Well," Dan chuckled, shaking his head. The boy swallowed his pride and ate his breakfast, but his peace of mind was entirely gone. At noon they came back into the kitchen for dinner, a big spread of turnip greens, pinto beans, and cornbread. The old man handed him the same plate. This time, the boy didn't even have to look closely. There was a faint, stubborn rim of yesterday's red-eye gravy, still hugging the edge of the stoneware, like a topographical map. The lad cleared his throat, his stomach doing a minor flip-flop. "Grandfather, I don't mean to be a burden," he pleaded, "but are you absolutely positive about the structural integrity of these dishes? They look a little historical." The old man slammed his heavy fork down onto the table, making the salt shaker jump an inch in the air. He glared at the boy over his bifocals. "Look here, boy," the old man barked. "I already told you once, and I ain't going to tell you again. Those dishes are as clean as cold water can get them. Now sit down, shut your mouth, and don't ask me about my kitchen management ever again." The guardian of the screen door. By mid-afternoon, Dan the man continued, his voice dropping into a suspenseful whisper, while the folks at the counter leaned in. The boy was feeling a little claustrophobic and a whole lot nervous. He decided he needed to walk down to the creek to clear his head and get away from the old man's temper. He marched down the hallway, grabbed his cap, and reached for the back screen door to head out to the pasture. But he couldn't open it. Sitting directly on the linoleum rug, blocking the exit like a four-legged stone wall, was the grandfather's massive 90-pound shaggy-haired mountain hound. This wasn't a friendly creature. The dog was lying flat on his belly, his heavy ears pinned back, showing a row of teeth as white as picket fences. The moment the boy took a step forward, the hound let out a low, deep, window-rattling growl that sounded like a diesel engine idling in a cave. The boy froze, sweat pouring down his neck. He took 3 slow steps backward and hollered toward the kitchen. "Grandfather, you've got to help me. Your dog is at the back door, he's showing his teeth, and he absolutely will not let me pass." The final order. The old man tramped out of the kitchen, Dan the man shouted, slamming his hand flat against the laminate counter for theatrical effect. He took one look at the hallway standoff, shook his fist at the floor, and bellowed at the top of his lungs, "Cold water, bad dog. Get your tongue off the boy's boots and get the heck out of the way." The counter at Jack's erupted into an absolute chorus of gravelly barks and clinking coffee mugs. Butch Hampton nearly choked on a sweet potato fry, and Larry just shook his head in pure, unadulterated admiration. I declare, Dan the man laughed, finally taking a bite of his steak. The boy didn't eat another bite off a plate for the rest of the summer. He spent the next 2 months eating his biscuits straight off a paper napkin. A high standard of sanitary expectation and an elderly hound dog acting as the primary dishwasher do not fit together in any modern handbook. But if you're living up on the ridge, you learn really quickly that cold water can get things a whole lot cleaner than you ever wanted to know. Chapter 13, The Ultimate Ticket. If you happen to find yourself down at Jack's on a Saturday morning when the rain is turning the red Alabama clay into soup, you'll usually find Jim Henry holding court near the napkin dispenser. Jim has spent a lifetime studying the strange, locked-in nature of a sports fan's brain, and he firmly believes that when a man gets a notion in his head, common sense completely evacuates the premises. Just the other day, the fellas at the counter were arguing about how much money people spend on football tickets, which caused Jim Henry to lay a sausage biscuit down, look out the window, and deliver a classic yarn about the hierarchy of absolute devotion. The view from the 50-yard line. Now there are sports fans, Jim Henry began, his voice dropping into that familiar front porch cadence. And then there are people who treat a ball game like a high holy day. Take old Otis from down near the creek. Otis had a stroke of luck that nobody in this county could believe. He won a radio contest and ended up with 2 tickets to the Super Bowl. And we aren't talking about the nosebleed section up where the oxygen is thin. These were prime, 50-yard line, first row, luxury cushioned seats right down where you could smell the stadium turf. It was the biggest sporting spectacle on the planet. When Otis arrived, the stadium was a roaring sea of 90,000 screaming people, lights flashing, and television cameras rolling. He found his section, walked down the steps, and sat right down on the 50-yard line. A few minutes before kickoff, a fella from out of town came walking down the aisle, holding a hot dog and a program. He looked at the stadium, looked down at the row, and noticed that the premium seat directly next to Otis was completely, inexplicably empty. The stranger blinked in disbelief, leaned over and tapped Otis on the shoulder. "Excuse me, mister," the stranger said, pointing his hot dog at the empty cushion. "Is anybody actually sitting there?" Otis shook his head really slowly. "No," he said, "the seat is empty." The modern mystery. "Well," Jim Henry chuckled, stirring his coffee, "the stranger looks like he's just witnessed a miracle." "That is absolutely incredible," the man gasped, looking around at the packed stadium. "Who in their right mind would have a ticket like this for the Super Bowl, the absolute pinnacle of the sporting world, and just not show up to use it? You could sell that seat for the price of a brand new pickup truck." Otis looked up. His face was perfectly calm and serious. "Well, friend," Otis said, "actually, that seat belongs to me. I bought the pair of them. I was supposed to come here with my wife, but she passed away suddenly last Tuesday. This is the very first Super Bowl we haven't been to together since we got married back in 1987. The family absence. The stranger's face instantly dropped, Jim Henry continued, pausing to let the weight of the story hang in the air, while the fry cook stopped scraping the grill to listen. "Oh, man, I am so incredibly sorry to hear that," the stranger stammered, pulling his cap off his head. "That is a tragedy. That's really heartbreaking. But still, mister, it seems an awful shame to let a seat like this go to waste. Couldn't you find anybody else to come with you? A close friend, a cousin, a nephew, or even a next-door neighbor from back home to take the extra ticket?" Otis slowly shook his head, adjusted his glasses, and looked back out at the kickoff team lining up on the field. "No," Otis mumbled, completely unfazed. "I tried to ask them, but they're all over at the funeral home right now, waiting on the service to start." The post-game analysis. The counter at Jack's went completely quiet for a beat before Butch Hampton let out a gravelly roar of a laugh that vibrated the glass pie carousel. Larry nearly dropped his sweet tea, shaking his head in pure amazement. "I declare," Jim Henry laughed, picking his biscuit back up. "Otis had his priorities mapped out, And he wasn't about to let a minor thing like a burial disrupt the sports calendar. A solemn white linen family funeral and a stadium rocking kickoff on the 50-yard line do not fit in the same county handbook. But if you've been holding on to a ticket since 1987, I reckon some folks are willing to let the family handle the heavy lifting while they handle the game. Chapter 14, the Texas Custom of Dispute Resolution. If you slide into the back day room where the Jack's adult daycare men gather on Thursday afternoons, right around the time they bring out the checkerboards and the sugar-free lemonade, you'll find Floyd. Floyd is a man who understands that the law of the land isn't always found in a leather-bound book up in Atlanta or Austin. Sometimes true justice is engineered right out in a cow pasture. Just yesterday, one of the fellows was complaining about a property line dispute with the county, which caused Floyd to lean back in his vinyl armchair, hook his thumbs in his suspenders, and lay out a legendary chronicle concerning a high-dollar California litigator, an old Texas farmer, and a local piece of poultry. The intrusion of the silk stocking. Now this lawyer, Floyd began, his voice dropping into that deep, slow-rolling ridge drawl, was the kind of man who wore a three-piece suit to breakfast and had a mouth that ran faster than a greased pig on a downhill slope. He'd come down from San Francisco to do a little high society duck hunting along the rural Texas border, carrying a shiny, custom-engraved double-barrel shotgun that cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. He was walking the brush line when a mallard flew over. He raised, went bang, and dropped the bird clean. The only trouble was that the duck folded its wings and dropped like a stone right into a cultivated field on the other side of a rusty 5-strand barbed wire fence. The lawyer started climbing over the posts, his fancy Italian leather hunting boots caked with dark loam, when he heard the heavy, rhythmic chugging of an ancient, oil-leaking John Deere tractor. Driving the machine was an elderly farmer whose face looked like a piece of dried beef jerky left out in the July sun. He pulled the throttle back, killed the engine, and stared down from the iron seat. "Mister," the farmer said, "what exactly do you think you're doing on my side of the wire?" The legal threat. The litigator puffed out his chest, adjusted his shooting glasses, and put on his best courtroom glare. "I shot a duck," the lawyer announced, pointing a manicured finger toward the weeds. "It fell in this field, and now I'm going to retrieve my property." The old farmer didn't even blink. He just reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a plug of tobacco, and took a slow chew. "This here is private property, counselor," the farmer said flatly, "and you ain't coming over here to retrieve nothing." Well, that did it. The lawyer's face turned the color of a ripe plum. He pulled out his gold-plated pen and shook it at the tractor. "Listen to me, you old coot. I am one of the top trial attorneys in the United States of America. If you try to obstruct me from my bird, I will file an injunction so fast it'll make your head spin. I'll sue you for emotional distress, property interference, and I will take your tractor, your house, and every square inch of this dirt you're sitting on." The local custom. Floyd chuckled, leaning forward so the men at the table could hear over the shuffling of the dominoes. The old farmer just smiled a slow, toothless grin and climbed down from the big rubber tire. "Well now," the farmer said, dusting off his denim overalls, "apparently they don't teach you how we handle the small stuff down here in Texas. We don't waste time with judges and paperwork for a 20-minute disagreement. We settle things like this with the Texas 3-kick rule." The lawyer narrowed his eyes, his legal mind looking for a loophole. "And what exactly is the Texas 3-kick rule?" "It's simple," the farmer explained. "First, I kick you 3 times anywhere I please. Then you turn around and kick me 3 times anywhere you please. We go back and forth like that, civil-like, until one of us decides to give up the claim on the duck." The attorney stood there in the weeds and did a quick mental calculation. He looked at the old farmer's frail shoulders, his trembling hands, and his 70-odd years of accumulated mileage. He figured he could take 1 or 2 feeble taps from the old man and then absolutely obliterate the codger on his own turn. It seemed like an open and shut case. "All right," the lawyer smirked, dropping his shotgun into the grass. "I'll abide by your local custom. Let's get this over with." The structural evaluation. The old farmer walked up real close, Floyd said, his eyes widening as he gestured with his hands. He didn't hesitate for a single second. Kick number 1. The farmer planted the toe of a size 12, steel-toed, manure-encrusted work boot directly into the lawyer's groin with the force of a hydraulic mule. The litigator's eyes doubled in size. His breath left his lungs in a sharp hiss, and he dropped straight to his knees like a man looking for a dropped contact lens. Kick number 2. Before the lawyer could even groan, the old man swung his leg back like a punter and caught the barrister right across the bridge of his nose, completely wiping his shooting glasses off his face and turning his legal vocabulary into a mouthful of copper-tasting dust. Kick number 3. The lawyer was flat on his belly, clutching the Texas dirt, when the farmer delivered a final, devastating kidney shot that nearly made the man see the heavenly choir right there in the afternoon sun. The sanctuary of that pasture went dead quiet except for the lawyer, sucking wind through his teeth. The surrender. It took that big city attorney a full 5 minutes to summon every ounce of human will he possessed. Floyd laughed, slapping his knee. He groaned, he crawled, and he finally managed to hoist himself up by holding onto a cedar fence post. His nose was leaking, his suit was ruined, and his ribs felt like they'd been run over by a logging truck. He wiped the blood from his mouth, squared his shoulders, and looked at the old man with pure, unadulterated vengeance in his eyes. "All right, you old coot," the lawyer wheezed, clenching his fists. "I survived it. Now, it's my turn." The old farmer just smiled, walked back over to his John Deere, and climbed up onto the iron seat. "No, I don't think so," the farmer called down, pulling the starter rope. "I give up. You can go ahead and have the duck." The day room at Jack's adult daycare erupted into a chorus of gravelly barks and coughing fits. 2 of the men nearly knocked the checkers off the board, and Floyd just sat back, thoroughly satisfied with the delivery. It just goes right back to the old truth about things that don't fit together. A multi-million-dollar education from Stanford Law and a size 12 steel-toed boot do not fit in the same square of dirt. But if you're going to practice law in a Texas pasture, you'd better make sure you know who gets to go first. The Friday morning sprawl. Tales concerning the daily operations, logistics, and sudden physical hazards of life around the corner booth. Why the women folk call it daycare, the men call it research, and a slick spot of buttered biscuit can upend county physics. If you ever listen to the women folk around Piney Grove, they'll tell you that the covered booths down at Jack's restaurant on a Friday morning are nothing more than a subsidized adult daycare center for men who have reached a certain mileage. Mabel, Linda, and Needlecone have a standing agreement to drop off their husbands by 7 a.m. so they can get out of the kitchen while the house is being swept. But if you ask Jim Henry, Larry, or Butch Hampton, they will fiercely correct the terminology. It isn't daycare. It's a high-level, heavily caffeinated community research symposium. The agenda of the symposium. Every Friday, the order of business at the large corner booth follows a strict, time-tested itinerary. They don't need a secretary to take minutes because the topics never actually change. The gridiron analytics, a deep, exhaustive evaluation of Alabama football, the current state of SEC recruiting, and exactly why the coaching staff needs to run the ball up the middle more often. The political arena, a granular breakdown of county politics, which usually amounts to Jim Henry pointing his fork at the highway and explaining how he could pave the county roads for half the price using recycled slag. The theological debate, a spirited discussion on the Bible, church building budgets, and whether Pastor Cohn's recent sermons have been running 5 minutes too long into the lunchtime hour. "We are preserving the very fabric of this municipality," Jim Henry would tell the waitress, adjusting his suspenders. "If we don't sit here and iron out these issues, the whole county structure collapses by Tuesday." The incongruent ref call. This past Friday, the research was operating at a particularly high voltage. Dan the man was leading the discussion on a controversial refereeing decision from the previous season, using a bottle of hot sauce and a salt shaker to map out the defensive secondary on the laminate table. Robert got so carried away demonstrating a blatant holding penalty that he forgot the cardinal rule of Jack's ancient wooden dining chairs. Never shift your center of gravity while sitting on grease-polished linoleum. Robert leaned back to show how the wide receiver was pulled down, gesturing wildly with his arms. His back left chair leg hit a slick spot where a stray bit of buttered biscuit had migrated earlier in the morning. The leg shot out. Robert's face turned into a portrait of pure, mid-air terror as he began a slow-motion, backward descent toward the subfloor. The chain reaction of care. Now, this is where the lyric of the old song transitions from theory into absolute local history. Butch Hampton, sitting in the adjacent booth, saw Robert's hair start to disappear below the table line. Being a funeral director used to handling heavy sudden movements, Butch's instincts kicked in. He didn't want to see a fellow researcher crack his skull on the brick baseboards. Butch shouted, "I gotcha, Robert!" and lunged across the aisle, reaching out a massive, calloused hand to snag the front of Robert's denim overalls. The physics of the rescue. Butch forgot that he himself was balancing on a lightweight plastic stool near the counter. When his 240-pound frame launched forward, his own stool slipped sideways. Instead of saving Robert, Butch caught the edge of Larry's tablecloth. Larry, who was right in the middle of taking a scalding, hot sip of regular coffee, felt the entire table shift 6 inches to the left. To save his coffee, Larry threw his weight to the right, kicking his legs out under the table. His heavy work boot caught old brother Walter's cane, which was hooked onto the partition. The cane snapped loose, slid under Jim Henry's chair, and acted like a roller skate. The final sprawl. Within exactly 3 seconds, the entire research department of Piney Grove executed a beautiful, simultaneous, multi-directional collapse. It was a magnificent spectacle of senior gravity. One fell from his chair, another tried to care, and down to the floor they all did fall. The air was filled with flying hash-brown confetti, the hollow thud of denim hitting pine, and the frantic jingling of pocket change. When the dust settled, all 4 men were laid out flat on their backs in the main walkway, looking straight up at the acoustic ceiling tiles like a collection of overturned turtles. Right at that exact moment, the front screen door jingled open. Linda and Mabel walked in, carrying their grocery bags. They stopped in the doorway, looked down at the pile of limbs, overturned furniture, and scattered sweet potato fries, and then looked at each other. Linda took a slow chew of her gum, shook her head, and looked down at Harold, who was pinned beneath a vinyl cushion. "Well, Mabel," Linda sighed, reaching into her purse for her car keys, "it looks like the daycare needs a nap. Pick up your researcher and let's go home." Chapter 15. The Great Transmigration of the Ridge. If you find yourself down at Jack's during that slow stretch of the afternoon, right when the heavy loggers have cleared out, and the only sound is the rhythmic hum of the pie carousel, look for Robert. Being a retired county school bus driver, Robert spent 3 decades watching the world through a massive rearview mirror. He always says that if you want to know what a human being actually believes, you don't listen to the preacher on Sunday. You listen to a 7-year-old talking to himself in the back row of a bus. Just the other day, Butch Hampton was talking about how hard it is to explain the concept of an estate plan to some families, which made Robert set his coffee mug down and chuckle into his paper napkin. The tragedy in the driveway. You can spend all the time you want trying to pass down deep, structural wisdom to the next generation, Robert said, leaning his elbows on the counter. But the trouble with the youthful mind is that it doesn't always digest the grease the way you cooked it. It reminds me of a little fellow named Timmy who lived out on the edge of the Piney Grove line. One hot June morning, Timmy went running out to check the mailbox and found a big, shaggy-tailed gray squirrel lying right at the edge of the gravel. It had clearly been clipped by a passing pulpwood truck. Now Timmy hadn't ever encountered the stark finality of the world before. He sat right down in his overalls in the dirt and began crying. We aren't talking about a little whimpering either. He was letting out a high-volume, continuous wail that brought his daddy running out from the equipment shed. The paternal lecture. Timmy's daddy was a good man, but he was a bit literal-minded. Seeing his boy heartbroken over a rodent, he figured this was the absolutely perfect, high-level educational opportunity to teach his son a gentle lesson about the mysteries of the universe. He sat down on the grass next to the boy, put his arm around his shoulders, and went into a deep philosophical discourse on life, death, and the grand design. He explained how every creature has its season and how when the spirit leaves the vessel, the physical shell stops moving. Then, to make sure the lesson had some practical, day-to-day utility, the father pointed a finger at the asphalt. "Now look here, son," the daddy said, his voice dropping into a solemn, instructional tone. "The main thing you need to understand is that the very same thing that happened to this poor little creature could happen directly to you if you ain't careful. If you go running across this road without looking both ways, you're liable to end up exactly like this squirrel right here." Timmy stopped crying. He wiped his nose on his denim sleeve, stared hard at the dead squirrel, and then stared at his daddy. He gave a slow, profound nod, looking like a boy who had just looked deep into the mysteries of the deep. The evening evaluation. That evening, Robert chuckled, shaking his head, Timmy's mother went upstairs to tuck him into bed. She'd heard about the big backyard seminar from her husband, and she wanted to reinforce the safety aspect of the lesson before the boy went to sleep. She smoothed down his sheets, sat on the edge of the mattress, and gave him a warm, motherly smile. "Honey," she said softly, "your daddy told me about the sweet talk you two had out by the mailbox today. I'm so proud of you for listening. Tell me, what exactly did you learn from your talk with Daddy?" Timmy pulled the blankets up to his chin, his eyes perfectly round and serious in the lamplight. "Well, Mama," the boy whispered, completely confident in his new theology, "I learned that when you die, you turn into a squirrel." The verdict at Jack's. The counter at Jack's erupted right on cue. Jim Henry let out a gravelly bark that caused the fry cook to drop his spatula, and Butch Hampton just shook his head, thoroughly enjoying the breakdown of communication. "I declare," Robert laughed, taking a slow sip of his coffee, "the daddy spent 45 minutes delivering a premium sermon on automotive safety and cellular mortality, and the boy just walked away thinking he was going to spend eternity gathering acorns in a hickory tree." It just goes right back to what Fred Craddock always said about things that don't fit together. A grand, solemn lecture on human fragility and a sudden late-stage transformation into a tree rodent do not fit the same handbook. But if you're 7 years old, a tail and a stash of walnuts sound a whole lot better than a cemetery plot. Chapter 15. The Rooster's Early Fanfare. Henry Ward's favorite yarn is about a flawless yard bird, a late-stage territorial scrap, and the absolute necessity of not crowing too early. If you happen to catch Henry Ward down at Jack's right around mid-morning, just when the kitchen is transitioning from breakfast grease to lunch burgers, you'll find a man who deeply appreciates a quiet operator. Henry has spent a lifetime observing folks in Piney Grove, and he has a particular distaste for a man who feels the need to broadcast his own ledger before the bank even closes for the day. Just the other morning, a fellow at the end of the counter was bragging a bit too loudly about the horsepower in his new tractor, which caused Henry Ward to set his ceramic mug down, lean back on his stool, and recount the time a big city newspaper reporter came down to interview old man Silas, the wealthiest farmer on the ridge. The reporter's expedition. The young reporter had driven all the way down from Atlanta, carrying a fancy leather briefcase and a digital recorder, determined to uncover the grand, foundational secret behind Silas's decades of agricultural success and financial stability. He sat on the front porch, pen poised, expecting a deep lecture on compound interest, modern crop rotation, or market speculation. Old man Silas just rocked slowly in his wicker glider, took a slow sip of his ice water, and pointed a calloused finger out toward the chicken coop in the side yard. "Son," Silas said in a dry drawl, "if you want to know how I kept this farm from going under during the depressions and the droughts, you don't need to look at a ledger. You need to understand the psychological history of a particular Rhode Island red rooster I owned back in the 70s. That bird was an absolute marvel of nature." The champion of the barnyard. According to Silas, this wasn't just any ordinary yard bird. On paper, this rooster was a physical specimen that should have ruled the entire county. He possessed a level of natural athletic talent that left every other bird on the ridge completely in the dust. Silas laid out the rooster's premium credentials for the reporter. The flight. He could launch himself higher than the roof of the smokehouse to escape a fox. The peck. His beak was like a diamond-tipped jackhammer on a gravel road. The agility. He could jump, dodge, and pivot sideways before a chicken hawk could even drop its talons. He was faster, stronger, and meaner than any creature feathers ever covered, Silas explained. In any straight-up contest of flying, pecking, or jumping, he was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the township. The fatal flaw of pride. But the trouble was, Silas chuckled, shaking his head as he looked out at the dirt yard. The bird possessed a devastating, high-volume character defect. He'd get into a territory scrap with some scrawny, half-plucked, one-eyed bantam rooster that had wandered over from the neighbor's property. Our champion would absolutely dominate the arena. He'd have that little bantam bird completely whipped, driving him ragged across the yard, pecking him into submission until victory was 99% assured. But right then, at the exact moment he was winning, our rooster couldn't help himself. The pride would well up in his gizzard. Instead of delivering the final knockout blow to finish the job, he'd step back, puff out his chest, throw his head back, close his eyes, and commence to letting out the loudest, most triumphant, self-congratulatory cock-a-doodle-doo you ever heard in your life. Silas tapped his cane against the porch floorboards. And every single time, while our champion was standing there with his eyes closed, broadcasting his own greatness to the rest of the county, that half-dead little bantam bird would scramble up out of the dust, catch him completely blind, and peck him right in the back of the neck until our rooster went screaming into the briar patches. He lost every major fight he ever had to much weaker birds, purely because he couldn't wait until the fight was over to brag about it. The philosophy of the counter. Henry Ward paused, letting the story settle over the counter at Jack's, while the fry cook stopped his spatula mid-scrape to listen. Old man Silas told that reporter that he took that rooster's lesson straight to the bank. Henry Ward smiled, wiping a stray drop of coffee from the laminate. Silas realized early on that most men don't get ruined by the hard work. They get ruined by their own early victory laps. Butch Hampton nodded in pure agreement from the next booth, and Henry Ward pointed his spoon out toward the highway to deliver the final, unvarnished truth. It reminds me exactly of what old Samuel Chadwick used to tell folks, Henry Ward said, his voice dropping into a solid, front porch cadence. He'd look at a young man starting and lay down the ultimate rule of survival. If you're successful, don't crow. And if you fail, don't croak. You keep your mouth shut, keep your head down, and wait until the harvest is completely in the barn before you start making noise. Chapter 16, The Geometry of the Pulpit Steps. If you happen to catch Pastor Cone down at Jack's on a quiet Monday morning, right when the Sunday rush is a memory and he's nursing a single cup of black coffee, you're likely to get a lesson in the high-voltage hazards of spiritual pride. Pastor Cone has spent a lifetime watching young men enter the ministry, and he knows that the Lord has a very particular, very efficient way of leveling out a high hill. Just the other day, a young traveling evangelist had left a stack of glossy color brochures on the counter, looking a bit too pleased with his own resume. Pastor Cone looked at the brochures, took a slow sip of his coffee, and shared a story a well-respected seminary professor had once confessed to him about his very first preaching opportunity. The swagger of the scholar. Now, this professor was a brilliant man later in life, Pastor Cone said, resting his calloused hands on the laminate table. But back when he was 22 years old, he was full of fresh Hebrew roots, high-dollar vocabulary, and an absolute surplus of self-confidence. He'd been invited to fill the pulpit at a traditional country church, and he arrived fully convinced that he was God's gift to the rural landscape. He looked out at those quiet, hard-working farming folks sitting in the pews, and he actually felt a wave of pity for them. He figured his theological brilliance was going to completely shake up those stodgy parishioners and prove once and for all just how smart he was. When the time came for the sermon, he didn't just walk up to the platform, He practically swaggered. He threw his shoulders back, adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses, carried his leather-bound notes like a shield, and marched up those wooden pulpit steps with the air of a conquering emperor ascending his throne. The dismal descent. But the trouble with the pulpit, Pastor Cohn chuckled, shaking his head, is that the air gets incredibly thin up there when you're relying on your own steam. The young man gripped the edges of the hand-carved oak, looked out at the congregation, opened his mouth, and the machinery completely stripped its gears. The brilliant introduction he'd memorized vanished into the rafters. The deep theological Greek points sounded like a lawnmower choking on an old rag. Within 3 minutes, he realized that preaching was a whole lot harder than it looked in the textbook. He was doing a dismal, agonizing job, and every single soul in the building knew it. After about 10 minutes of sharing a few mumbled, incoherent, completely tangled thoughts, his confidence didn't just crack, it shattered. He didn't swagger down those steps, friends. He collapsed them down. His shoulders were hunched, his head was bowed, his notes were crumpled under his arm, and he slunk back to his seat in a state of total, unadulterated despair, wishing the floorboards would open up and swallow him whole. The architecture of pride. He stood by the back double doors during the closing hymn, Pastor Cohn continued, his voice dropping into a gentle, rhythmic cadence. He was waiting for the bricks to start flying. Instead, a weathered old saint of the church, a man who had spent 80 years watching the corn grow and the rain fall, walked up to the young preacher. The old man didn't look angry. He just had that deep, patient look in his eyes that country folks get when they see a horse try to jump a fence that's 2 feet too high. The old man reached out, shook the boy's trembling, sweaty hand, leaned in close, and delivered a piece of premium, diamond-tipped architectural advice. Young man, if you had gone up there the way you came down, you could have come down the way you went up. The rarity of the virtue. The small crowd around the counter at Jack's went quiet. Jim Henry slowly nodded his head, and Larry laid his napkin down with a soft sigh. I declare, Pastor Cohn said, looking down into the dark reflection of his coffee, how rare it is in this world to find a person of true humility. Most of us want to build a tower out of our own credentials before we even know how to dig a foundation. It goes right back to what Fred Craddock always preached about the things that don't fit. A swaggering, arrogant spirit and the broken, grace-filled gospel of the cross do not fit in the same wooden box. But if you're willing to start at the bottom step with your head bowed, the Lord will usually find a way to help you stand up straight when the time is right. Chapter 17, The Divine Ledger of the Valley. If you spend enough Fridays down at Jack's, you eventually learn the unspoken rules of the counter. Jim Henry will talk over anybody. Dan the man uses enough hand gestures to flag down a crop duster, and Larry loves a good debate. But when Harold clears his throat and lays his fork down flat across his saucer, the entire restaurant goes completely, reverently quiet. Harold doesn't waste his breath on small talk, which means when he decides to spin a yarn, the text is going to be pure heavyweight wisdom. The other afternoon, the boys were arguing about who owned the largest tract of timberland along the ridge, which caused Harold to look up from his coffee, stare out past the neon sign, and deliver the unvarnished truth about old Carl, a tenant farmer named Hans, and the true geometry of wealth. The pride of the property lines. Now, old Carl, Harold began, his voice low and steady like a cold diesel engine idling in the morning air, was a man who didn't just own land, he owned the view. He had thousands of acres of premium bottomland, rolling hills of loblolly pine, and a bank account that could have bought the county courthouse twice over. Carl's favorite pastime was to saddle up his high-dollar thoroughbred horse and spend the afternoon riding the perimeter of his estate, looking at his fences and congratulating himself on his magnificent fortune. He liked the weight of his own shadow. One blazing hot Tuesday, Carl was trotting his horse down by the shaded creek bottom when he spotted old Hans. Now Hans was a tenant farmer who had lived in a small, weathered cabin on the backside of the property for 40 years. He was sitting on a cedar stump under the shade of a massive, ancient white oak, his lunch laid out on a clean piece of wax paper. As Carl pulled his horse to a stop, he noticed Hans' head was deeply bowing, his wrinkled hands clasped together, completely lost in a silent prayer. When Hans finally looked up, he blinked against the glare and smiled. "Oh, excuse me, sir," the old man said, his voice soft and polite. "I didn't hear the horse. I was giving thanks for my midday sustenance." The contrast of riches. Carl looked down from his leather saddle, Harold continued, shaking his head. He looked at the wax paper on the stump. Hans's lunch consisted of nothing more than a thick, coarse wedge of dark rye bread and a small hunk of hard rind cheese. It was the meal of a poor man who lived hand to mouth. Carl let out a loud mocking snort. "Hmm, well, Hans, I've got to tell you, if that dry crust of bread and that little piece of cheese were all I had waiting for me in this world, I don't think I'd feel like thanking the Almighty." Hans didn't look offended in the slightest. He just picked up the bread, broke it in half, and smiled at the landowner. "Oh, sir, it is quite sufficient for my needs," Hans said gently. "The Lord provides exactly what the day requires. But it's a remarkable thing that you should ride down this path today, Mr. Carl. I I feel like I ought to tell you, I had a mighty strange, heavy dream just before I woke up this morning." Carl chuckled, leaning his hands on the saddle horn with an amused, patronizing grin. "Is that right? And what exactly did a man who eats dry bread dream about?" Hans looked at the great oak tree, his eyes going perfectly serious. "It seemed there was a beautiful light and a deep peace all around me," the old man whispered. "And yet, clear as a bell, I could hear a voice echoing across the hills saying, 'The richest man in the valley will die tonight.'" Carl's face hardened for a split second, and then he let out a booming laugh. "Dreams!" the landowner shouted, pulling his horse's reins around. "Absolute, unadulterated nonsense. You spend too much time in the sun, Hans." And with that, Carl dug his spurs in and galloped away, leaving a cloud of red dust over the oak grove. Hans watched the horse and rider disappear into the trees, clutched his hands together, and prayed softly, "Lord, have mercy on his soul if he really is to leave us so soon." The anatomy of a panic. Now Carl tried to tell himself it was ridiculous, Harold said, pausing to take a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee while the whole counter leaned in. He told himself a wealthy, modern man didn't get worked up over the midnight visions of a poor tenant farmer. He tried to forget it. But the human mind is a funny piece of machinery. The harder Carl tried to bury that sentence, the louder it rattled around in his skull. The richest man in the valley will die tonight. By 5 o'clock that evening, Carl had completely convinced himself he didn't feel well. His chest felt tight, his left arm felt heavy, and every tick of the grandfather clock in his mansion sounded like a countdown. In a fit of pure, blind panic, he called his personal doctor, a fellow who also happened to be his closest country club friend. "You've got to get over here immediately," Carl pleaded into the receiver. "It's an emergency. I need a full evaluation." The doctor came tearing up the driveway in his luxury sedan, rushed into the study with his medical bag, and listened while Carl frantically laid out the entire story of the old man under the oak tree. The doctor just laughed and shook his head. "Carl, that sounds like pure country poppycock to me," the doctor said, pulling out his stethoscope. "But for your own peace of mind, let's run the numbers." The medical certificate. The doctor gave Carl a thorough, top-to-bottom workover. Harold chuckled, a dry smile touching his lips. He checked his blood pressure, tapped his reflexes, listened to his lungs, and watched his heart rhythm. Half an hour later, the doctor packed his tools away and patted Carl on the back. "You can rest easily, my friend," the doctor assured him. "Your heart is ticking like a Swiss watch. You're as strong and healthy as that thoroughbred horse of yours. There is absolutely, scientifically, no way you're going to die tonight. Have a glass of brandy and go to sleep." Carl breathed a massive sigh of relief. He felt incredibly foolish for letting a poor old man's superstitions ruin his evening. He thanked the doctor, locked his heavy oak doors, and went to bed, sleeping soundly through the midnight hour. The audit of the morning. "The next morning," Harold said, his voice dropping into a quiet, rhythmic cadence that made the grease smoke from the kitchen seem to vanish. Carl woke up at 8 o'clock, the sun shining bright through his velvet curtains. He stretched his arms, looked in the mirror, and felt completely vindicated. He was alive, he was well, and he was still the king of the valley. At exactly 9 o'clock, there was a heavy, hurried knocking at his front door. Carl opened it to find one of the young boys from the neighboring property standing on the porch, holding his cap, his face pale. "Mr. Carl," the boy stammered, looking down at his boots. "I was sent up here to bring you the news from the backside of the ridge. It's old Hans, sir. He passed away peacefully in his sleep last night." The verdict of the corner booth. Harold stopped talking. He picked his fork back up, took a bite of his cherry pie, and left the silence hanging over the counter at Jack's like a heavy Sunday morning fog. Jim Henry didn't say a word. Larry just stared down at his napkin, and Butch Hampton slowly nodded his head. Harold murmured, setting his fork down with a soft click. "The world keeps its books using property deeds, bank vaults, and high-dollar thoroughbreds. We look at a man's coat to see what he's worth. But when the Almighty decides to run an audit on the valley, he doesn't care about the size of the estate. He looks to see who is truly rich toward God. Old Carl thought he owned the land, but it turned out Hans was the one who owned the treasure." Chapter 1-8, The Voice-Activated Passenger Seat. John Springfield's classic account of a high-tech digital showroom floor, an artificial dashboard voice, and the ultimate value of a wife. The Friday morning sprawl down at Jack's has a slightly quieter tone to it these days since old John Springfield passed on to his great reward. John was the kind of table dweller who didn't feel the need to crowd the room with words, but he possessed a dry, rhythmic wit that could level a skyscraper. His empty spot at the corner booth is still sacred ground. Whenever one of the younger fellows walks in bragging about the high-tech gadgets on his new smartphone, the regulars always bring up the legendary story John loved to tell about his brief encounter with the modern automotive industry. The Sultan of the Showroom Floor. "Now John was a plain-dressed man," Jim Henry would say, shaking his head with an affectionate smile. "He wore the same shade of faded denim overalls every single day of his life, which meant slick-minded folks from out of town often miscalculated the depth of his pockets and the sharpness of his mind. A few years back, John's old farm truck finally gave up the ghost right in the middle of the bypass. He reluctantly wandered onto the lot of that big neon-lit dealership over in Boaz, just looking for a sensible, no-frills replacement. He hadn't been on the asphalt for 30 seconds before he was spotted by a young, ambitious car salesman wearing shiny white shoes and a gold watch. This fellow was the self-proclaimed Sultan of the showroom floor, and he took one look at John's work boots and figured he could easily dazzle this unassuming country soul into buying their most expensive, high-margin luxury sedan. The digital backseat driver. "The salesman didn't take John to the truck lot," Larry chuckled, joining in on the memory. "Instead, he marched him straight into the showroom and ushered him into the plush leather interior of a brand new top-of-the-line computerized model. This vehicle didn't just have wheels, friends. It had a brain. It was equipped with the latest artificial, computer-generated voice system designed to monitor every single aspect of the driving experience. The salesman started the engine, and immediately a crisp, robotic lady's voice chimed out from the dashboard speakers. 'Please fasten your seatbelt. Door is ajar.' The salesman grinned like a mule eating briars. He started hitting buttons, showing off the digital architecture. 'You see this, Mr. Springfield?' The salesman beamed, tapping the dashboard. 'This car looks out for you. If you start running low on regular unleaded, that little voice will tell you exactly how many miles you have left. If dusk falls and you forget your high beams, she'll tell you it's time to turn on your lights. She tracks how far you've traveled, she monitors your oil pressure, and if you go even 1 mile an hour over the county speed limit, she'll instantly pipe up to tell you how fast you're going.' The absolute ultimatum. John just sat there in that luxury leather seat," Robert laughed, leaning over the counter. "He didn't get excited. He didn't tinker with the knobs. He just watched that little green light blink on the dashboard while the computer voice told him the windshield wiper fluid was operating at optimum capacity. The salesman figured he had the deal completely locked down. He leaned through the driver's side window, put on his finest closing argument smile, and deployed the heavy artillery. He slapped the roof of the car and proclaimed, "Sir, I am telling you the truth. There is absolutely nothing in this world that this automobile won't tell you." The verdict of the regulars. "Well," Harold said, taking over the finish with that slow, steady drawl of his, "John didn't argue. He didn't sign the paperwork. He just calmly unbuckled his seatbelt, pulled his old felt cap back down over his ears, and stepped out onto the showroom floor. He looked at that shiny car, looked that young salesman dead in the eye, and let out a soft, dismissive shrug. "Well, son," John said, completely unbothered, "why in the world would I pay good money for one of those? I've already got a wife." And with that, John walked straight off the lot, caught a ride down to the Tractor Supply, and bought himself a used flatbed with manual windows. The big booth at Jack's went completely quiet for a second as the regulars looked over at John's empty seat by the window, the sweet memory of his quiet laughter hanging thick in the air. "I declare," Jim Henry murmured, raising his coffee mug toward the corner, "it goes right back to the gospel truth about things that don't fit together. A high-dollar digital computer matrix and a man who has been happily married for 45 years do not need to share the same cab. But as long as we're sitting at this table, we'll make sure John's research stays alive and well in Piney Grove." Chapter 19. The Tangled Roots of the Ridge. If you happen to be down at Jack's on a rainy Friday when the courthouse crowd is staying inside and the coffee pot is working overtime, you'll eventually hear the fellas get around to discussing family trees. In Piney Grove, genealogy isn't just a hobby, it's a structural safety hazard. Half the town is related by blood, and the other half is related by marriage, leading to some cousin connections that require a slide rule to figure out. Just yesterday, Dan the man was trying to map out his third cousin, once removed on a paper napkin, which caused Floyd to lean back in his booth, let out a slow, mischievous chuckle, and lay down the ultimate mind-bending chronicle of a family tree that completely stripped its gears. The Courting of the Widow. "You boys think you've got a complicated ledger?" Floyd began, shaking his head as he stirred his sugar-free lemonade. "But you haven't seen anything until you look at the knot I tied back when I was a young man of 23. I was living over by the county line when I fell head over heels for a widow who was just as pretty as a mid-May morning. She was a fine lady, but she came with a household, specifically a grown-up, fire-engine red-headed daughter who had a personality like a lightning storm. Now my own daddy was a widower himself, and he was a man who still had a lot of run left in his engine. He started coming around the house to visit us, and before the ink was even dry on my own marriage certificate, my daddy went ahead and fell madly in love with my new red-headed stepdaughter. Within 2 months, the preacher had them wedded too." The first shift in geometry. "Well," Floyd said, pausing to let the fellas at the counter do the math, "the second that happened, the whole architecture of my life completely shifted. Because my daddy married my stepdaughter, my dad instantly became my son-in-law. And to make matters worse, that red-headed girl, who was technically my daughter by marriage, was now my mother simply because she was my father's wife. Linda told me at the time that I shouldn't worry about it, but it's hard to sleep soundly when your own father has to ask you for permission to watch the evening news." The arrival of the uncle. To complicate the ledger further, Floyd chuckled, although it brought a whole lot of joy to the house, my pretty wife soon gave birth to a bouncing, beautiful baby boy. We had a big celebration down at the church, but when I sat down to fill out the family Bible, my brain nearly locked up. See, that new baby of mine was automatically a brother-in-law to my dad, because the baby was my wife's son, and my wife was my dad's mother-in-law. And if that baby was my dad's brother-in-law, that meant the little feller was technically my uncle, which made me feel really sorrowful for the boy's future discipline. Because if he were my uncle, that also made him a brother to my dad's wife, who, as you recall, was my red-headed stepmother. The ultimate generational collapse. "But the wheel kept on turning," Floyd continued, his voice dropping into a suspenseful cadence while Jim Henry laid his fork down to listen. My father's new wife, my stepdaughter, soon had a baby boy of her own to keep them on the run. Now that little newborn was my biological brother, since he was my daddy's son, but he was also my grandson because he was the son of my stepdaughter. Which brings us right down to the grease in the skillet. My wife was now my mother's mother, which made me bluer than an indigo snake. Because even though she was my beautiful, lawful wife, the strict geometry of the state of Georgia dictated that she was also my grandmother. And if my wife were my grandmother, then it stood to reason that I was her grandchild. The audit of the self. Floyd paused, taking a slow sip of his lemonade, while the entire back booth at Jack's sat in stunned, mathematical silence. Every single time I sat on the porch and thought about it, Floyd laughed, slapping his knee, it simply drove me wild. I had become the strangest medical and legal case this county had ever seen. For you see, Floyd whispered, leaning over the table, as my grandmother's husband, I had officially become my own grandpa. The counter at Jack's erupted into an absolute chorus of gravelly barks and clinking coffee mugs. Butch Hampton nearly choked on a sweet potato fry, and Larry just shook his head in pure, unadulterated admiration. I declare, Jim Henry laughed, wiping his eyes with a paper napkin. That's a family reunion where you only have to buy one name tag. A young man's prime of life and his own senior grandfatherhood do not fit in the same pair of denim overalls. But if you're living out on the ridge, you learn real quick that love doesn't care a lick about the Census Bureau. See Chapter 20, The Perfect Ophthalmic Foursome. If you ever find yourself down at Jack's on a bright Friday morning when the dew is still clinging to the grass outside the bypass, you'll likely catch Jim Robinson sitting on the far end of the counter. Jim isn't a man who feels the need to crowd the airwaves with constant chatter. Still, he possesses a deep encyclopedic appreciation for a well-engineered piece of humor, especially the kind old President Ronald Reagan used to tell on the evening news to illustrate the strange ways of the human machinery. Just the other morning, Butch Hampton was complaining about his fading vision and how he couldn't see a deer in the brush anymore, which caused Jim Robinson to set his coffee cup down, lean his elbows on the laminate, and deliver a classic yarn about the limits of medical teamwork. The fairway dilemma. Now, sports and senior mileage don't always run on the same tracks, Jim Robinson began, his voice dropping into that comfortable front porch cadence. Take the game of golf. It's hard when you have all your faculties, but when the numbers on your birth certificate start creeping up, the geometry of the course changes completely. There was an 80-year-old fellow in the next county who lived, breathed, and slept in the game of golf. He had the swing of a much younger man, his shoulders were limber, and he could strike a golf ball with a clean, beautiful thwack that would send it sailing straight down the center of the fairway. But he had a devastating late-stage problem. His eyes were completely shot. The second the ball left the tee, it would vanish into the blue sky like a phantom. He'd spend 40 minutes tramping through the rough, cursing the weeds, and losing $3 worth of Titleist on every single hole. He was right on the verge of sidelining himself from the game forever, and it was breaking his spirit. The medical matchmaker. In pure desperation, Jim continued, spinning his spoon around his saucer, the old man went to see his primary care physician to see if there was a prescription or a high-powered set of spectacles that could fix the trouble. The doctor listened to the dilemma, scratched his chin, and realized he had an incredibly unique, highly experimental solution sitting right in his database. It just so happened that the doctor had another patient, a 90-year-old gentleman who was built like an old cedar post. The doctor evaluated the two men's physical ledgers. The 80-year-old had a premium, high-octane golf swing, but possessed the vision of a subterranean mole. The 90-year-old possessed the magnificent, falcon-like eyesight of an eagle, able to spot a tick on a deer's ear from 100 yards away. The only catch? He suffered from periodic, sudden bouts of short-term memory loss. The doctor figured this was a match made in medical heaven. It's a perfect corporate merger, the physician told them. One of you provides the muscle, the other provides the tracking radar. Together, you're a championship team. The drive on the first tee. Well, the two old fellows were absolutely thrilled. Jim Robinson chuckled, shaking his head. They met up at the local country club the very next morning, both of them dressed in their finest polo shirts, raring to dominate the afternoon. They walked out to the first tee box. The 80-year-old stepped up, went through his practice swings, and carefully teed up a brand new, bright white ball. He took a deep breath, shifted his weight, and unleashed an absolute masterpiece of a drive. He hit it right on the sweet spot. The ball rocketed off the club face, soaring high and beautiful, tracking a straight line right down the absolute center of the fairway. The golfer's eyes instantly clouded over. He couldn't see an inch past his own knuckles. He spun around in pure excitement, gripped his driver, and hollered at his 90-year-old partner. "Did you watch it? Did you see exactly where that ball landed?" The 90-year-old stood there on the grass, his eyes wide and clear as crystal. He gave a slow, definitive nod of his head. "Yep," the spotter boomed proudly. "I saw it the whole way, kept my eyes locked right on it until it hit the turf." The short-term deficit. The 80-year-old let out a joyous hoot, already imagining his name on the clubhouse leaderboard. Jim Robinson laughed, pausing to let the fellas at the counter lean in for the finish. "Fantastic!" the golfer shouted, pulling his golf cart into gear. "Well, don't keep it a secret, old friend. Where did the ball go? Where's it sitting?" The 90-year-old's face suddenly went entirely blank. A look of deep, profound remorse washed over his features, and he adjusted his cap with a trembling hand. "Well, counselor," the old spotter whispered, looking out at the empty landscape, "I'm terribly sorry to report. I can't remember." The post-game analysis. The counter at Jack's erupted into an absolute chorus of gravelly barks and clinking coffee mugs. Butch Hampton nearly choked on his biscuit, and Larry just shook his head in pure, unadulterated admiration for the breakdown of the system. "Bless his heart," Jim Robinson smiled, taking a final sip of his coffee. "The doctor thought he'd built a high-tech navigation system, but he forgot that if the hard drive deletes the data before you hit the gas, you're still stuck in the parking lot. A perfect, high-octane athletic drive and a 90-year-old memory bank do not fit in the same sporting handbook. But if you're playing 18 holes on the ridge, you'd better enjoy the swing itself, because the destination is anybody's guess." Chapter 21. The Law of Instant Recovery. If you sit at the counter down at Jack's long enough on a sweltering summer afternoon, you'll witness a beautiful pattern. The loud arguments about politics will drift away. The clinking of silverware will slow down, and a deep, comfortable silence will settle over the booths. That's usually when Larry finishes his second glass of sweet tea, sets his napkin down, and breaks his quiet spell. Running a rural mail route for over 3 decades taught Larry that nothing focuses a man's mind or improves his physical health, quite like a sudden change in circumstances. Just the other day, Jim Henry was complaining about a nagging ache in his lower back, which caused Larry to look out the window, clear his throat, and share the legendary chronicle of Old Man Miller, a treacherous curve on Route 1, and the fastest medical recovery in the history of the county. The incident at Dead Man's Curve. "Now, Old Man Miller," Larry began, his voice dropping into that smooth front porch cadence, "was a farmer who didn't believe in rushing for anybody. One crisp autumn morning, he was taking his time driving his old flatbed pickup down the ridge. He had his faithful old blue-tick hound dog riding shotgun right next to him in the cab, and he was towing his finest quarter horse in a heavy wooden trailer behind him. They were rounding that narrow, blind horseshoe curve down by Dead Man's Curve when a massive triple-axle pulpwood truck came roaring over the center line, taking its half of the road out of the middle. To avoid a head-on collision that would have sent him straight to the graveyard, Miller twisted the wheel, blew his horn, and went careening off the shoulder. The pickup plunged down a steep embankment, flipping the horse trailer into the briars and leaving the truck wedged sideways against a massive sweet gum tree. The executive decisions of the law. It wasn't 10 minutes later, Larry continued, leaning forward against the laminate counter, that a young, shiny-booted highway patrolman came rounding the curve. He saw the skid marks, turned on his blue lights, and hit the ground running. This patrolman was fresh out of the academy, full of textbook procedures, and possessed an intense clinical efficiency. He scrambled down the ravine to assess the structural damage. He didn't find comfort anywhere he looked. The trailer. The prize quarter horse was pinned beneath the wreckage of the wooden partition, suffering terribly with two broken legs. The cab. The poor old blue-tick hound had been thrown through the glass and was lying in the weeds, broken-backed and whining in absolute agony. The patrolman's face went grim. He knew the merciful rules of the wilderness. He didn't hesitate. He unholstered his heavy service revolver, walked over to the horse and bang, put the poor creature out of its misery. Then he marched over to the ditch, looked down at the suffering hound dog, and bang, administered the same final mercy. The ultimate wellness check. The valley went dead quiet. Larry smiled, pausing to let the hum of Jack's refrigerator fill the room while Butch Hampton leaned in to listen. The only sound left was the ticking of the hot truck engine and the faint smell of gunpowder drifting through the pines. The young patrolman reloaded his pistol, clicked his holster shut, and turned his attention to the cab of the pickup truck. Old Man Miller had finally managed to crawl out of the driver's side door. He was sitting on a mossy log, his overalls torn, covered in dust, scratches, and ditch water, trembling like a leaf in a gale. The officer marched up, pulled out his official accident report clipboard, looked down at the battered farmer, and asked the standard bureaucratic question. "Sir, I've taken care of the animals. Now, how exactly are you doing?" The clean bill of health. Larry paused, a slow, brilliant grin spreading across his wrinkled face as he looked around at the regulars at the counter. Old Man Miller didn't look at his scratches, Larry laughed. He didn't check his pulse. He just stared hard at the officer's hip, looked at the faint wisp of blue smoke still rising from the leather holster, and stood up straight as a telephone pole. With a voice clear as a Sunday morning bell, Miller replied, "Officer, I'm going to tell you the honest-to-God truth. I have never felt better in my entire life." The post-accident verdict. The counter at Jack's erupted right on schedule. Dan the man let out a bark of a laugh that rattled the sugar dispensers, and Jim Henry completely forgot about his bad back, slapping the counter in pure admiration. "I reckon old Miller didn't even file an insurance claim for whiplash after that," Larry chuckled, taking a final sip of his sweet tea. He discovered that the human body could cure itself of any ailment if the alternative looks a little too final. A catastrophic roadside wreck in a state of perfect hallelujah. Physical health do not fit the same picture. But if you see the law running around the ditch with a smoking iron, you learn really quick to declare a full recovery before the officer decides to check your paperwork. Pastor Cohn said, "You won't believe this. Needle, my wife, got an earful from our granddaughter when the little girl returned from her first trip to the circus. Mrs. Null asked her granddaughter how she liked it. The little girl said, 'Oh, Granny, if you ever went once, you'd never be satisfied with church again.'" Chapter 21. The Hazard of the Middleman. If you happen to be down at Jack's on a lazy afternoon when the heat is rising off the blacktop and the only sound is the rhythmic clinking of the ice machine, you'll usually find the regulars arguing about business logistics. Just yesterday, Dan the man was complaining about a livestock broker who took a hefty percentage of a cattle trade just for standing between two barns. That was all it took for Jim Robinson to break his quiet spell. Jim has a deep, encyclopedic appreciation for historical anecdotes, particularly the ones that demonstrate how a go-between can completely alter the course of human events. He set his coffee cup down, wiped his mouth with a paper napkin, and shared a classic yarn concerning a tough Texas Ranger, a legendary outlaw, and the ultimate language barrier. The Desert Pursuit. "Now y'all think a modern insurance adjuster is slick," Jim Robinson began, his voice dropping into a smooth, rhythmic cadence that made the whole counter quiet down. "But you haven't seen anything until you look at the old days along the border. Everyone in Texas knew the name Pancho Villa. He was an outlaw of the highest order, a phantom of the high desert who had just pulled off the granddaddy of all train robberies, making away with a cool $1 million in gold coins. The authorities were frantic, but nobody had the nerve to look for him. except for one legendary, leathery Texas Ranger. This ranger was a man whose face looked like it had been carved out of a hickory stump, and he possessed an absolute surplus of grit. He trailed Villa's horse tracks through 300 miles of scorching, cactus-choked desert, never stopping to sleep, until he finally tracked the outlaw down to a tiny, sun-baked village deep across the Mexican line. He found Villa sitting by himself in the shadows of a quiet, dirt-floor cantina. The ranger didn't knock, and he didn't announce his arrival. He just kicked the slated doors open, stepped into the room, and drew both of his heavy Colt revolvers, cocking the hammers with a sound like a dry branch snapping. The arrival of the interpreter. The ranger marched right up to the table, Jim continued, gesturing with his spoon. He pointed those big iron barrels straight at the outlaw's chest and barked out his ultimatum. Pancho, your riding days are officially over. Turn over the $1 million you robbed from that locomotive, or your next destination is the county cemetery. Pancho Villa just sat there behind his mustache, his eyes darting back and forth, completely silent. Suddenly, from the far side of the bar near the pool table, a scrawny, unassuming little fellow in a dusty poncho stepped out into the light. He raised his hands real polite-like and looked at the lawman. "Excuse me, Senor Officer," the little man whispered, "but I must inform you that Pancho does not comprehend a single word of your English tongue. He has lived his entire life south of the river. However, I am a man of commerce, and I would be honored to act as your humble translator." The final confession. The ranger didn't lower his guns an inch, Jim Robinson chuckled, shaking his head. He just narrowed his eyes and looked at the little fellow. "All right, translator," the ranger growled. "You tell Pancho that I didn't ride through the heat and the dust for a conversation. You tell him I came for that gold. If he doesn't hand over the location of that $1 million right this second, I am going to fill him so full of holes he won't even hold water." The little man gave a quick nod, turned to Pancho Villa, and delivered a rapid-fire, high-velocity stream of Spanish, translating the ranger's lethal promise word for word. Well, when Pancho looked down at the dark, cavernous barrels of those Colts and saw the cold, unblinking look in the ranger's eyes, his nerve completely broke. The great outlaw started sweating through his shirt, threw his hands in the air, and poured out his heart to the interpreter. "Tell him the gold is safe," Pancho pleaded in Spanish, his voice trembling. "Tell the lawman it is buried exactly 2 miles north of this very village. If you walk 30 paces due east of the old stone abandoned well, you will find it hidden beneath a pile of mesquite brush. Take it all. Spare my life." The absolute translation. Jim Robinson paused, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, while the fry cook stopped scraping the grill to listen. The entire corner booth at Jack's leaned in, waiting on the ledger to close. The little translator listened to every single word, Jim laughed, a brilliant grin cutting through his wrinkles. He nodded really slowly, memorizing the exact geometry of the treasure. Then he turned his face back to the Texas Ranger. He put on a face as solemn as a Sunday morning funeral, looked at the smoking hot pistols, and delivered his official translation. "Senor Ranger, Pancho says he appreciates your travel time, but he ain't telling you a single thing. In fact, he said he thinks you're a coward, and he dares you to go ahead and shoot." The verdict of the sprawl. The counter at Jack's erupted right on cue. Butch Hampton let out a gravelly bark of a laugh that vibrated the glass pie carousel, and Dan nearly spilled his sweet tea, shaking his head in amazement at Jack's table dweller's wisdom. "I swanny," Jim Robinson chuckled, picking his biscuit back up. "Pancho learned the hard way about delegating his communication department. Perfect, honest accuracy and a self-employed middleman standing in front of $1 million in gold do not belong in the same county handbook. But if you're going to hide your treasure in the brush, you'd better make sure you're the one holding the dictionary." Chapter 22. The Saints of the Second District. If you slide into the back corner booth at Jack's on a rain-soaked Monday morning, you'll usually find Pastor Cone nursing a cup of black coffee, recovering from the emotional and spiritual output of his Sunday sermon. It's a quiet, respectful hour until Butch Hampton, the county funeral director, steps through the screen door. Butch spends his life dealing with the final logistics of the human race, which means he has a front row seat to the strange things families do when the ledger finally closes. Just yesterday, Butch slid a plate of hash browns across the table, leaned in close to Pastor Cone, and said, "Preacher, you think you've had some tightrope walks in the pulpit, but you won't believe how a service was conducted over in the next district last week. The scoundrels of the valley." Now everyone down in the valley knew the Murdoch brothers, Butch began, his voice dropping into that low, rhythmic funeral home drone that carries clear across a room. "We'll call them Silas and Elam. To say these men were unrighteous would be putting a coat of Sunday paint on a garbage heap. They were ruthless, perverse, backbiting scoundrels who spent 50 years cheating widows, rigging livestock auctions, and souring every well they ever looked into. When Silas finally kicked the bucket, the consensus around the county square was that the local oxygen quality had instantly improved. There wasn't a tear shed from the river to the ridge. The real rub came when it was time to arrange the final send-off. The surviving brother, Elam, who was twice as mean and 3 times as rich as the dead one, marched straight into the study of a young, uncompromising country minister who was struggling to keep his church roof from caving in. The sanctuary bargain. Elam didn't beat around the bush, Butch chuckled, shaking his head. He sat down in the pastor's study, laid a heavy leather briefcase full of crisp $100 bills right on the desk, and laid out his terms. "Preacher," Elam growled, "I want my brother Silas buried right, and I want you to handle the ceremony. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you stand up in that pulpit and explicitly refer to my brother Silas as a saint during the eulogy, I will personally sign over the deed and the cash to build you a brand new brick sanctuary, complete with stained glass and central air conditioning." "Well, Pastor Cone," Butch smiled, "you know the kind of agony that puts in a minister's gizzard. This young preacher was a man of strict integrity. He didn't believe in lying for the living, let alone the dead. But every time he looked out his study window, he could see the tar paper peeling off his church roof. He looked at the briefcase, looked at the ceiling, took a deep breath, and agreed to the challenge." The uncompromising eulogy. "The day of the funeral arrived," Butch continued, his eyes widening as he gestured with his fork, "and the chapel was packed out with locals who had come exclusively to see how the preacher was going to get out of this box. Elam was sitting right in the front row, crossing his arms, waiting to see if he'd bought himself a premium verdict. The young minister stepped up to the pulpit. He didn't swagger, and he didn't blink. He opened his Bible, looked old Elam dead in the eye, and commenced to deliver the most brutally honest evaluation of a human life this county had ever heard. He laid out the ledger clear as day. He talked about Silas's fierce, unrepentant greed. He reminded the crowd of the families Silas had ruined through predatory land loans. He spent 10 solid minutes cataloging a lifetime of sinful, dark, and deceitful behavior that had kept the town in misery for 40 years. Back in the wings, the preacher's wife was sweating through her handkerchief. She was deeply proud that her husband hadn't compromised his soul for a building fund. Still, she was absolutely terrified because she knew the sanctuary money was floating out the window with every sentence. The ultimate calculation. The preacher reached the conclusion of his notes. Butch laughed, leaning over the laminate table while the fry cook stopped his spatula mid-scrape to listen. The tension in the sanctuary was thick enough to cut with a pocket knife. The minister closed his Bible, placed his hands flat on the oak pulpit, and looked down at the copper casket. "Now, brothers and sisters," the preacher announced, his voice echoing into the rafters, "there is absolutely no question in any mind here today that this deceased man was a lifelong servant of wickedness, an enemy of righteousness, and a personal friend of Satan himself. But when you compare him to his surviving brother, Elam, sitting right here in the front row, Silas was an absolute saint." The counter at Jack's erupted. Pastor Cone let out a booming, chest-rattling laugh that caused his coffee to slosh over the rim of his ceramic mug. Jim Henry nearly choked on his bacon, and Larry just shook his head in pure, unadulterated admiration for the pastoral maneuver. "I declare," Pastor Cone laughed, wiping his eyes with a paper napkin. That preacher didn't just save his integrity, he engineered a masterpiece. Elam had to pay for the building to keep from looking worse than a corpse. A pristine, holy brick sanctuary and a premium, gold-plated scoundrel do not belong in the same church directory. But if you're a preacher working with a leaky roof on the ridge, you learn really quick that relativity can be the finest tool in the gospel kit. Chapter 23. The Gathering at the Corner Booth. The rain had finally blown off the ridge, leaving the Georgia sky that clean, washed shade of blue you only see late in the season. Inside Jack's, the air smelled of the midday transition, the last of the breakfast bacon giving way to the sizzle of hamburger grease on the flat top. The large corner booth was completely packed. For the first time in months, every single seat in the research department was occupied. Jim Henry was holding his usual court near the napkin dispenser. At the same time, Dan the man carefully adjusted his weight on his wooden chair, testing its balance on the linoleum with a cautious nudge of his boot. The inventory of scraps. "Well, fellas," Jim Henry said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the laminate. "I've been looking over the county inventory, and it appears to me that the ledger for this season is just about plumb full. We have covered an immense amount of theological and cultural territory at this table." Larry took a slow, quiet sip of his sweet tea, set the glass down with a soft click, and smiled. "We surely have, Jim. We've run a lot of mail down some crooked roads. If somebody had told me at the start of the year we'd trace a line from a 50-yard line ticket at the Super Bowl clean through to a Texas cow pasture with a three-kick rule, I'd have told them their radiator was boiling over." "Don't forget the navigation systems," Robert chimed in, laughing as he adjusted his cap. "Between John Springfield's voice-activated passenger seat, Lord rest his soul, and President Reagan's ophthalmic golf duo, I've come to the conclusion that human beings will do just about anything to avoid reading the instruction manual." Butch Hampton let out a gravelly roar of a laugh that caused the pie carousel to vibrate. "Shandies and scoundrels, Robert. That's what we've cataloged. I'm still thinking about that funeral service over in the 2nd District. Pastor Cone, I don't know how you held your face straight when that boy called old Elam's brother a saint by comparison." Pastor Cone chuckled, nursing his single mug of black coffee. "The ministry requires a deep appreciation for relativity, Butch. If you don't look for the contrast in the canvas, the whole picture looks dark. It goes right back to what Fred Craddock always taught us about the things that don't fit together. A swaggering preacher up in the pulpit, or a rich man like Carl trying to buy a lease on tomorrow morning, they just don't fit the design." Harold's grinder metaphor. Henry Ward, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the bench, cleared his throat. The table slowed its chatter just a fraction. "The main thing," Henry said, "is that we didn't do any early crowing. We kept our heads down, kept our mouths shut, and waited until the season was entirely in the barn before we made any noise." Suddenly, the salt shaker stopped rattling. Harold laid his fork down flat across his clean saucer. As was the custom at Jack's, the moment Harold's fork hit the porcelain, the entire booth went completely, reverently quiet. Even the fry cooks behind the counter stopped their spatula mid-scrape. "You know, boys," Harold said, his voice low and steady, like an old diesel engine idling in the morning frost, "I've been sitting here listening to y'all tie these threads together, and it strikes me that what we've been doing at this table all season isn't any different than how we used to process sausage on the old farm down in the Grove." The men leaned in, completely attentive. "When you process a hog," Harold explained, looking around the table, "the big cuts get the immediate attention. But when the day is winding down, you gather up all the scattered pieces, the leftover scraps, the little oddities and fragments that don't look like much on their own. You bring them over to the cast iron grinder, and you run them through the hopper together." Harold pointed a wrinkled finger at the center of the table. "That's what these stories are. We took the raw, unvarnished pieces of our stumbles, our foolishness, and our local history, and we threw them into the machine. We added a heavy dash of local spice for flavor, and we let them sizzle over the open fire of this Friday morning crowd. And I'll tell you what, the aroma it threw into the air was completely satisfying." The pastoral benediction. A deep, comfortable warmth settled over the booth. Jim Henry slowly nodded his head, and Butch Hampton quietly wiped a stray crumb from the table. Pastor Cohn looked at the empty spot by the window where John Springfield used to sit, then looked back at the faces of the regulars who had kept the research alive. He placed his calloused hands flat on the table, and the men instinctively bowed their heads just a few inches. "Harold's right," Pastor Cohn whispered gently. "Every scrap of life we've shared here has its place in the grand design. Lord, we give you proper thanks and praise for the raw materials of this community. Thank you for the hams and the tenderloins. But thank you most of all for the leftover scraps, for the laughter that bridges our stumbles, for the grace that covers our pride, and for the simple privilege of sitting at a table where nothing of value is ever allowed to go to waste. We take our satisfaction in the fellowship, and we offer up our deepest thanksgiving for the season we've had." "Amen," Jim Henry murmured. "Amen," echoed the rest of the sprawl. Harold picked his fork back up. Larry took a final drag of his sweet tea, and outside, the midday sun finally broke completely through the Alabama pines, warming the red clay for whatever trail was coming next. Here is a complete, print-ready blueprint for your novella. It organizes the stories we have processed into thematic sections, capturing that signature blend of front porch wisdom, humor, and small-town grace.